Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? How are you? It is a lovely afternoon. I am here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment, and we're going to have one of our lovely Sunday afternoon chats. It's a sunny day. I tell you, folks, I woke up yesterday morning. My wife was, at a meetup, and so I was just kind of there at the house. Woke up, I put on some Mozart music like I do every morning, and I sipped my unnamed diet beverage. And I must say, it was a lovely feeling. You have to enjoy those little moments of happiness in life where you just peacefully wake up, put on that peaceful classical music, and enjoy the world. So, I have in my hand here some unnamed diet beverage. Fills me up with caffeine, which is probably not good for me. This is my vice. But I enjoy it, and I enjoy spending my Sunday afternoon with all of you here on social media, on YouTube. And I'm glad you're with me. I have quite an interesting list of topics to speak about today. Of course, I'll be answering your questions, engaging with you, my audience, if you would like. And I don't think of you as an audience, right? Right? An audience, right? That gives the impression that you're just a passive observer, that I'm just doing a song and dance here and, with a cane and a hat and, pleasing the gallery, and you all are just passively sitting out there. I don't think of you all as an audience. I think of you all as a participant. I feel like we're on a journey together. You and me. This is a collaborative effort. And the more of you that are here, the more fun we have. And the more you all do to promote this, the more fun we have. The more intriguing questions you guys ask, the more fun we have. This isn't a passive, audience. This isn't like going to the movies, right? This is a situation where you are part of it. I am part of it. I'm answering your questions. We have running jokes between each other about diet soda and all kinds of stuff. We have slogans that we all know, right, folks? We need a government of action to fight for working families. We're having fun here. This is like an interaction. This is almost like a social meetup that we do every week. We know it's going to happen every weekend. It won't happen at the same time every weekend. But we know that it's going to happen. We can kind of count on it, right? Whenever I miss a weekend, which I don't do very much anymore, but whenever I would, all of a sudden, I'd be getting YouTube comments and Facebook messages. When's your next live? When are you going to do your next live? Right? Because this is fun, right? You all depend on me. I depend on you. We have kind of a fun little interaction here, and I enjoy it. And yesterday morning, I woke up and I drank some of that diet soda, and I listened to my Mozart, and the sun finally came out, right? Here in New York City, Friday, Thursday, just the rainiest, coldest, most miserable days ever. But the sun was out. It was freezing cold on Saturday, but the sun was out. And today, the sun is out, and it's less freezing cold. Still a little colder than I would prefer, a lot of that wind, but, we're moving toward spring. So I'm glad that you all are here with me. And I'm going to give you kind of a rundown of what's on my agenda. We're going to talk about the Iowa caucuses. We're going to talk about Bernie Sanders and what socialism actually means, and Chris Matthews' little meltdown against Bernie Sanders. And we're going to talk about the State of the Union and what Trump said. We're going to talk about the impeachment vote and some important stuff, details that you may not be aware of about that. We're also going to talk about Venezuela. We're going to talk about China a little bit. We're going to talk about the Irish elections that just happened. I think there's some significant stuff going on there. And I also want to talk to you all about Africa, because there's some important stuff going on with Africa that you may not be aware of in some different countries related to the oil crisis. And I want to clue you in on that as well. That's what's on my agenda for today. So why don't we start out today by doing that thing that we do, that thing that we always do, that we love doing, where you all call out your name and location, and I call you out as I see you, right? There's no need for me to jump into some big thing today. So now is the time, as you're joining us, to hit that like button. Now is the time to hit that share button and put this on your Facebook or on your Twitter and bring other people in. Oh my God, did you just hear what Caleb just said? Caleb is talking at us. Ramiro from East LA. No Iran. I'm so out, Caleb. Maybe I'll talk about Iran a little bit. I do have some stuff about Iran. Cornelius from Denmark. Charlotte from North Carolina. Upstate New York. Darth Buddha. Long Island. Brian. Silver Lake, Los Angeles. Blood Money LLC. Michael from Germany. Will DeMarco from Pennsylvania. Vassal from Albany, New York. Lawrence Chu. Hey, Caleb from Cleveland. Akeem from the Netherlands. Kentucky. Tampa, Florida. Herb. Hello, Caleb, says Space Communist. From a tractor trailer, says Dust James. Huntsville, Alabama. Liverpool, UK. From Tim. Cincinnati, Ohio. Jenny Lynn. Hello from Belgium, says Levon. Saxony, East Germany, says Etatist. Paul from Finchenstead. Columbus, Ohio, says Shonen Ronin. Planet Earth, says Adab DeBoost. I would hope you're from Planet Earth. If you're from somewhere else, that could get messy. Kansas City, Kansas, says Candy Ass Commie. St. Louis, says John L. John L. St. Louis. There you go, right? UK, New Jersey, says Pasta Bazooka. New Jersey. Orga Mecca in the United Kingdom. Boston, says Zealous. Adam from Reno, Nevada. Shout out to you, Adam. Truck driver in Utah, says Libertas. Space Communist says, you've got over 1,000 new subscribers within the last month. Well, thank you, and I hope we get more of them. And make sure that you're subscribed, folks. We know YouTube has this weird thing. It's actually set into their algorithm to unsubscribe people. If you don't watch me for a little while, you're going to get unsubscribed. So make sure that you're subscribed. Hit that subscribe button. Hit that bell. Make sure you hit that bell because you don't want that to happen to you. MMRED, Mr. Red. Hey, Caleb from California. George Kraft in Texas. Space Comrade, says Eggs D. I don't know if he's saying he's in space or he's just, praising my support for the space program. I do support the space program. Not a big fan of the Space Force. Can Sandersism lead to real socialism? Asks Libertas Ertina. Hello from Sweden, says Andy. Well, hello to you, Andy, out there in Sweden. Hi from Edinburgh, says Heidi Edelweiss. From Connecticut, says Magnetic Perbushin, right? Salam, says Vic. Salam. Well, there you go. Folks. So Bernie Sanders is the front runner in the Democratic Party. By all measures, he is the front runner. He's the front runner in the race, right? He's come out of Iowa doing amazingly well, despite, technical glitches that were rather interesting and amusing. And furthermore, he's looking to have a lead in New Hampshire as we head to the New Hampshire primary. And at this point, and this is very important, folks, this makes everything we do here very, very important. At this point, they've given up on pointing out that he's a socialist, right? Bernie Sanders goes around calling himself a democratic socialist. And the media has given up, just straight up given up on trying to use that as an axe or a bat to beat him over the head with. It doesn't work anymore. Just doesn't work. Bernie Sanders is a socialist. Bernie Sanders says, yes, I'm a democratic socialist. I, Bernie Sanders, am a democratic socialist. I believe in democratic socialism. That's what I've always believed in. Look, that's how I am. And it doesn't really work. And in fact, polls show that Americans, especially younger Americans, tend to have a favorable view of socialism. So we are on to phase 2 of Bernie bashing. Phase 2 of Bernie bashing. Donald Trump has tweeted out that Bernie Sanders is a communist. Not a socialist, but a communist. He is a communist. And I wonder, first of all, if Bernie Sanders is a communist, is going to be a justification for if Bernie Sanders gets the nomination for Donald Trump to not debate him. All right? We know that in 2016, Fox News, because they love viewership, right? The other networks are playing this game where they're trying to be, like CNN wants to be the official state media of the United States. It's private, but, I mean, they're trying very hard. They're in all the airports, and CNN would really like to be the official state outlet of the U.S. media. They play that role, though they're essentially private, right? And so CNN tries to do it one way. MSNBC tries to be kind of the more liberal answer to Fox News, but Fox News is just all about the ratings. All about the ratings. All about the ratings. Now, I've got a super chat asking me about Russian history books, so there we go. All about the ratings at Fox, and I will get to your question, so thank you for the super chat. Fox News is all about the ratings, and a Bernie Trump debate in 2016 would have been a ratings coup. I mean, who wouldn't have watched Trump and Bernie Sanders debate? And they offered both of the candidates a substantial amount of money to do it. They really wanted Fox News because they are all about viewership. They are all about the Benjamins. Fox News just wants to make money. Why do they lean so far to the right? Because who stays home throughout the United States watching television all day? Older folks in red states, right? Older folks in urban areas can go out and do stuff and all of that, but older folks in red states, not much going on. They're older, they stay home, and that's why Fox News is full of stair climber ads. That's why Fox News is full of Viagra advertisements. That's why Fox News is so conservative and right-wing. It's that elderly conservative, that's their audience, right? And if they're always top in ratings, Fox has the top ratings because there's a certain layer of, older baby boomer right-wingers who stay home all day and watch TV. And, that's you tell them what they want to hear, that the young people are out of control, that we need to get back to the Bible, that the people in Washington, D.C. are a bunch of socialists and communists and they hate America. That's Fox News knows what they're doing, right? By being kind of a very crass Republican-leaning outlet, and having heated debates. Fox News is very good at that. It's much more lively, right? Watch a Tucker Carlson segment. It's much more lively television, right? I mean, they get people who don't agree, who vehemently disagree with them, and they have shouting matches with them. That's good TV. People watch that, right? If you just have someone, I am stating the Democrat view, I am stating the Republican view, it's not as entertaining. But Fox, they have a boxing match, basically. They have a verbal boxing match between a Republican and a Democrat. They lean Republican. I mean, it's good for ratings. I mean, Fox is a marketing. They are about making money. It's about making money. Rupert Murdoch, he did it in the UK, right? With the newspapers and all of that. He was all about, he found a formula for appealing to certain demographics, and it worked in the United States. Fox News is, in terms of profitability, it's a very profitable, well-marketed operation. Fox is kind of brilliant that way. I don't agree with a huge amount of what's on Fox. I mean, every so often they might say something I agree with, but overall, Fox is not where I'm at. I'm just telling you that compared to the other networks, there's a reason that it's always ahead, right? It's a much more brilliantly marketed operation, and they wanted to have a debate between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders because they knew it would be good for ratings. Who would have missed that? You would have watched it. I would have watched it. I mean, everyone would have watched. Everybody would have watched. Everyone would have watched Bernie and Trump debate, right? Think about it. We all would have watched it. And Bernie said yes. Bernie said, okay, let's do it. I mean, I guess I should do the voice. Bernie, I would be happy to have a debate with Donald Trump. If I could debate him, I would be. So that's what Bernie said. And then Donald Trump, the Trump people said no. And they just straight up said no, they wouldn't have it. So I feel like this Bernie Sanders is a communist. This Bernie Sanders is a communist line. It's about more than simply, Bernie bashing. It is stage 2 of Bernie bashing, right? We've been calling him a socialist for all this time. Well, now he's a communist. And I believe that if he becomes the nominee, that Trump may very well say, this man's a communist, right? And we're going to see his support for the Sandinistas of Nicaragua. We're going to see him praising Cuba. And we're going to be told, and Trump will say, I'm not going to appear on this, and the helicopter will be running behind him. I am not going to appear on the stage with somebody who admires brutal anti-American dictators. Not going to do it, folks. I won't debate him. Helicopter behind him. That's what I'm thinking. I'm anticipating that if Bernie Sanders is the nominee, the allegation that Bernie Sanders is a communist, right, and is a quote-unquote traitor, right, that he was on the wrong side of every war, that he, that will be used to prevent, as the excuse for Trump not to debate Sanders. That's what I think is going on. I also suspect that there's more in the Bernie Sanders as a communist cabinet that we haven't seen. We know he visited the Soviet Union in the 80s, and that he had a relationship. Burlington, Vermont had a relationship. It was like a sister city to a Soviet city in the 80s. He was visiting the USSR a lot and praising them on certain economic accomplishments that they had, right? He was critical of the Soviet Union, but he also praised them for building great train systems and look, there's a lot more in that cabinet, and that cabinet of Bernie Sanders is a communist, Bernie Sanders is a Marxist. That cabinet's going to be opened up, and that is going to be the ammo on Bernie that comes from the right. Now, what's interesting about all of this, right, we saw, I don't know if folks saw, but after the recent Democratic debate, Chris Matthews, the MSNBC host, who's like a liberal, he's a Democrat, right? He went on a tirade against Bernie Sanders that wasn't really coherent. He said that, something to the effect of, I'm not quoting directly, he said that, basically that if the USA had lost the Cold War, I'm going to talk about coronavirus, thank you for that, that if the USA had lost the Cold War, he would have been executed in Central Park. He would have been executed in Central Park, and Bernie Sanders would have cheered for his execution. That's what Chris Matthews said. Now, I don't know what Chris Matthews was doing. He said this goes back to the 1950s. Wow. He's really, wow. Okay, so back in the 1950s, Chris Matthews was doing something that would have prompted him to be executed publicly if the communists took power in the United States. And furthermore, Bernie Sanders would have been one of the people who attended his public execution, would have been by like firing squad. Were they going to set up a guillotine in Central Park? I don't know what this is about. There's some weird stuff going on in Chris Matthews' head. I don't know what Chris Matthews was doing in the 1950s. He says this goes all the way back to the 1950s. I don't know why. It's one thing to believe that, that communists are murderers and stuff. That's pretty standard. But he has it in his head that if communists had won the Cold War, there would have been public executions in a specific place, that he would have been one of the people who would have been publicly executed in this specific place in Central Park in New York City. And furthermore, Bernie Sanders would have also been in attendance to these public executions and would have supported it. Now, folks, I don't even know where to begin with this. It sounds to me like Chris Matthews has got some psychological stuff going on, but I don't know. What was he doing in the 50s? Why does he feel like the executions would have happened in this place? And I don't know. It was a wild rant, folks. It was a very, very wild rant. Jenny Lynn says there's some dementia going on. Possibly. And furthermore, other people on the panel that were with Chris Matthews there were saying, well, he says it means Denmark, and they were kind of trying to calm Chris Matthews down because it wasn't making any sense. What in the world is he talking about? The whole thing was just very, very, very weird. But it's Cold War revulsion against Marxism and socialism. Number one, we know that's what it is. And number two, we're bouncing around quite a bit here, folks. I'm going to try to make sure this bouncing stops because I want the camera to hold still. This is Cold War stuff against communism. This is old man yelling, but this also sounds like something that somebody who was working with a government agency or somebody who was in the U.S. military would believe. It's weird. It kind of reminds you of, I don't know if people have seen the movie Master and Commander, right? Which is a movie about, people on a ship and, 1800s sailing captains. And when he's, stirring up his crewmates to fight against Napoleon, he says, do you want there to be a guillotine in London? That sounds like somebody was stirring up Chris Matthews. Do you want them to have public executions in Central Park? No, sir. Yeah, do you want Bernie Sanders to be cheering when they shoot us all? No, sir. This is like a military drill sergeant kind of routine. I swear. I mean, that's what I think was going on. But anyway, folks, Americans don't know what socialism is, and that's very, very clear. And the lack of knowledge of anything related to socialism and Marxism is getting to be kind of frustrating and embarrassing. So first of all, folks, is Bernie Sanders at this time a socialist? No. Bernie Sanders has made very clear that he does not believe that the banks, factories, and industries and the major centers of economic power should operate on the basis of public good and not profits. Bernie Sanders does not believe that the means of production should be controlled by society, not by private owners. Bernie Sanders does not believe in a centrally planned economy. Now, he did at one time believe that, right? In the 1970s, 1960s, even up into the 80s and 90s, he still believed in that kind of thing. He believed in achieving it gradually. Social democrats, social democracy is the belief that that's achieved one step at a time. There's no like clear event horizon that one day we'll have free healthcare, the next day we'll nationalize the oil, the next day and gradually we'll just kind of transition to socialism, right? Whereas communists believe that there is a clear event horizon, right? There's a clear moment when a society goes from capitalism to socialism. Socialism doesn't arise gradually. It arises in a revolutionary crisis. So Bernie Sanders being a social democrat, but at this point, he's basically dropped social democracy. Bernie Sanders' platform at this point calls for guaranteed health care to the entire population, guaranteed education to the entire population, and canceling of student debt, and paying for that by increasing the taxes on the rich. And that is welfare state economics. And that would be a good thing. If that were to be achieved, I would think that would be a good thing for the country. If we could have free healthcare, I think that would be great. No more people losing their homes because of medical debt, right? No more situations where people are in a really messed up situation because of medical bills. No more people afraid to go to the doctor because they don't know how they're going to pay for it, right? I mean, none of that, right? Guaranteed health care for the population. The state as the central insurer, right? He's not calling for an NHS to be created. He's not calling for the nationalization of hospitals. And he's calling for one insurance company, the state, that pays for everyone's health care. Medicare for all. That's what he's calling for. Basically the Canadian system. He's not calling for the British system. Not calling for what they have in France and Germany and places like that. He's calling for the state to be the central insurer and to insure everyone's health care, right? And we maintain a private situation with hospitals, private situation with drug companies, but the state is the central insurer. And he's calling for, canceling student debt, number two. And furthermore, he's calling for guaranteed health, guaranteed education, right? So the government basically pays everyone's tuition. Again, not government control over education, not nationalizing the university system like in most countries they have, right? But instead, government guaranteeing everyone, the ability to go to college, and those who have run up debt from going to college, the debt is canceled. That's basically what he's calling for. And that is something that would introduce a new level of stability into the capitalist market. It would be the state taking action for the benefit of certain members of the population, namely those who don't have health care or those who have very bad health insurance where they pay huge premiums, and, taking action on their behalf, and it would be an attempt to stabilize society, and millennials, young people, would particularly benefit from it. But it's not socialism. It is not, it is not the means of production functioning for the benefit of all society. Now, in the 70s, Bernie Sanders was associated with Trotskyists mainly, right? We know that in 1980, 1984, he campaigned for the Socialist Workers' Party, the big Trotskyite group in the United States. We know that in the 70s and 80s, he also visited Nicaragua and made positive statements about the Sandinista government there. In the 1980s, he went to Cuba. He praised Fidel Castro. He had positive things to say. He also had criticisms, about human rights and all that. But he had positive things to say about various Marxist governments in Latin America. And he was highly critical of the Soviet Union, but he praised the Soviet Union on the economic front, all right? And Is Bernie Sanders a communist? No, he's not, right? He no longer speaks that way. I mean, he referred to Hugo Chavez as a, quote, dead communist dictator. That he has completely, he's called Maduro a tyrant. He's very, very hostile to China. He's not a supporter of China at all. In fact, he's for more, he kind of calls for more of a trade war almost with China. So Bernie Sanders is not a communist. But the confusion gets even deeper than this, because so what is communism? What is socialism, right? I mean, this is getting weird, right? In the United States, people on the right wing in the United States believe that Obamacare, right, which did not involve any nationalization, which did not even guarantee health care to the population, it just gave you a fine if you didn't buy it. People believed that Obamacare was socialism. Obamacare was communism, right? However, those very, very same people that tell you Obamacare is communism. Can a Bernie presidency increase? I'm going to talk about that. All right. Those very same people that tell you that Obamacare is communism, if you point to the success of China economically, they say, oh, that's because it's capitalist. Now, China has almost 50% government ownership, right? The steel industry in China is government. Banking in China, government, right? Furthermore, the private sector in China, companies like Huawei Technologies, they're private, but the government basically tells them what to do. I mean, you could have a tiny little store in China, and if the government shows up and says, you got to do this, you got to do it. There are no private property rights. The state controls the means of production in China. They have a state central plan for what the economy is going to do. They tell the economy to do it, and it does it. Right? And that's why when when we had the financial meltdown, right, 2008, 2009, China just, boom, just moved ahead, right? That's why China's state-controlled, railway corporations are making the fastest trains in the world, right? That's why China has had uninterrupted growth for the past, decades, because they don't have that boom-bust cycle that's built into the capitalist system, right? That abundance does not create poverty, right? But you'll notice, and this is what gets really interesting, right? The New York Times, I want to mention this. The New York Times has been very odd lately. So about a year ago, the New York Times was on a kick of bashing China's healthcare system. China, you read the articles, and they have videos to accompany, China's healthcare system is awful. It doesn't provide good healthcare to people. And those videos were debunked, and those claims were largely debunked. Nathan Rich, who's a great, documentary filmmaker, Hollywood producer who lives in China, he made a great piece just ripping to shreds the New York Times, just showing they were lying. They were blatantly lying. These people who were in line, they weren't in line to get health care. They were in line to see a specialist that day, and they were mistranslating people. It was like really, this hit piece the New York Times did on the healthcare system in China was dishonest, just blatantly dishonest. But it points to a bigger question. Of all the things to attack China on, why did they pick the healthcare? Because healthcare is very important to people that are socialistic, right? That's a big central plank of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and that people that are leftists and socialists in the United States are very concerned about healthcare. So, hit China for the purpose of creating a gap between Americans who are leaning towards socialism and China. Why does the New York Times continue to run articles claiming that Marxist students in China have been arrested? Why? So that Marxists in the United States don't support China. And of course, are we surprised? The United States is capitalist. Are there not people all across our prison system who believe in capitalism? We don't know exactly what happened. Maybe these Chinese students were wrongfully arrested. But the notion that someone in China who believes in Marxism is in jail shouldn't be shocking to anyone, right? That would be like saying, oh my God, there's people in America in jail who believe in capitalism, right? Marxism is the ruling ideology in China. Every college student in China is required to take classes on Marxism. In China right now, they have some ultra leftist groups that feel like China has moved too much in a free market direction, and they're very big, and they're involved in some strikes and protests. Furthermore, in China, there are also weird Trotskyite groups and stuff. Furthermore, Marxism is the ruling ideology. So just saying Marxists were arrested in China doesn't give us the whole story. It doesn't, right? It doesn't. Now, we also know, and there's a whole history of this, and let me point this out, right? So the AFL-CIO, the Union Federation in the United States, they ran something during the Cold War, the International Federation of Free Trade Unions. Those were unions that banned communists from membership. And all across the Eastern Bloc, they were organizing labor unions that were against communism, right? Oh, Howie Hawkins is going to China. Didn't realize that, Lawrence Chu. And I'll mention Hawkins' climate change as well. I've got a pile of super chats here. So when we're done with this little bit, I will just go boom, boom, boom. I see they're coming in, and I will just address them boom, 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 point by point. There's this effort to try and create a gap between Marxists, or people that are interested in socialism in the United States, and China. There's also some weird things. The New York Times now has run 2 articles claiming that Venezuela has abandoned socialism. I kid you not, right? They ran an article saying, well, Venezuela's economy is getting better, which it is, right? The big economic problems they've been having since the oil price drop in 2014 are starting to be resolved. And there's kind of a boom, and, people are opening their own businesses with the help of the Chinese and with the Venezuelan government, right? The Venezuelan government, things are getting better. So the New York Times runs an article saying, well, maybe things are getting better, but it's because they've abandoned socialism because they have a market sector. And, Venezuela has always had a market sector, folks. I'm telling you, Venezuela's, state-controlled sector has basically been oil, some banking, some military stuff. I was there. It was a huge private sector. But that private sector is centered around the government. That's the whole thing, right? If it wasn't for oil, money and subsidies and all of that, in addition to a private sector that really depends on the public sector and kind of obeys state central planners because they need those oil subsidies. In addition to that, they also have the commune apparatus, like a lot of worker cooperatives and stuff. There's been an effort to kind of build factories that are like democratically and worker controlled. The commune apparatus, they call it, the collectivos. So, But Venezuela has always had a huge public sector. It's never had anything near the rate of public ownership that China has, right? In China, you're looking at about 50% public ownership. In Venezuela, it's always been roughly 20%, but that 20% subsidizes the rest of the economy. It's petro-socialism. It's a lot like Libya under Gaddafi. It's a lot like what Russia has now, where you have, a state-controlled energy corporation. In Venezuela's case, it's oil. And that makes huge amounts of money. And then the state, utilizes that money to subsidize the rest of the economy, right? That's what Russia has had. That's what the Putin administration created in Russia. That's what Libya had under Gaddafi. They called it Islamic socialism. That's what Venezuela has. So this notion that Venezuela has abandoned socialism because there's this boom, because a lot of Venezuelans are opening their own businesses and stuff right now, that's malarkey, right? I mean, and why are they opening these businesses? Because they're getting support from the state-controlled apparatus of the government. I mean, it's malarkey. Now they're running articles claiming that Venezuela has privatized their oil, right? That was in the New York Times today, right? Venezuela has privatized its oil. Actually read it. No, Venezuela has opened joint ventures with private companies to facilitate the expansion of their oil production. That's what's going on, right? And every country that has, government-controlled oil does that. I mean, the Soviet Union did that, right? Read about Armand Hammer. There are a lot of, companies that were, the Koch brothers, for goodness sakes, right? The father of the Koch brothers, Fred Koch, that's where he got his start. He was a chemist, and Stalin hired him to help the Soviet Union build up its state-run oil company. So, alliances, partnerships with private companies, that's not privatization. So the whole thing is just malarkey, right? So they're trying to create distance between China and Western leftists. They're trying to create distance between Venezuela and Western leftists. And it all starts to get confusing. Is socialism just when the government does stuff? That's what people believe, in the United States. If the government does it, that's socialism. If the market sector does it, that's capitalism. Wrong, right? In a lot of capitalist economies, the government does stuff. And in a lot of socialist economies, the private sector does stuff. The question is, who controls the economy? Is the economy under the control of the private sector? Does the government work for the corporations, or do the corporations work for the government? That's the difference between capitalism and socialism. There are some states around the world, most states in the world, including the United States, the government works for the corporations. And that's the reality. The government works for the corporations. Big money has the power. But in China, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and a lot of other countries, the corporations are beholden to the government. The government has the power, and the corporations do what the government says. And because of that, they are able to have growth and expansion economically in ways they would not have. China has had unprecedented economic growth, right? Russia in the 1930s, what Stalin and the 5-year plans were accomplishing, unprecedented, right? You look at what Cuba has achieved in terms of industrialization, in terms of healthcare. All of that happened because you didn't have profits in command. You had the state in command. You had the Communist Party, the government, which is rooted in popular committees, Bolivarian circles, committees to defend the revolution, Soviets, right? What does Soviet mean? Soviet was Workers' Council. You have a government that leads a highly mobilized population to dictate and have control over the economy. That's what socialism is, right? And because of that, you can have a rate of economic growth that's bigger because you're no longer held back by the irrationality of the market. And yes, in the 1920s, in the Soviet Union, they had, a big market sector, that new economic policy, the NEP, right? And in China today, they have a big market sector. Venezuela has a big market sector. Vietnam has a big market sector. But at the end of the day, the market sector is not in command. In 2015, the Chinese stock market tanked. Nothing happened. Right? If the stock market in the United States went down like it did in China in 2015, there would have been riots in the streets. There would have been riots in the streets if our stock market did anything close to what China's stock market did in 2015. In China, the government just called up all the major stockholders and said, yeah, you're not allowed to short sell. Any short selling, we arrest you. And the stock market was back up. And at the end of the day, like 4% of the population is even invested in the stock market. The Shanghai stock market is a betting casino for international investors. It's a way they can bring foreign money in to help build up their economy. It's not in command. The stock market doesn't have the power, right? If the stock market went down in the United States, like it did in China in 2015, food wouldn't be delivered. Electricity would go off. We would have a crisis because profits are in command. The stock market rules the United States. However, do folks remember the government shutdown? The government shutdown. We've had them. The government shutdowns, right? Under Obama, under Bill Clinton, government shutdowns where they don't fund the government because there's a fight in Congress. And what happens during government shutdowns? Nothing. Right? I mean, public employees don't get paid, right? People don't get their government benefits, their food stamps, but, the water still, comes. The electricity doesn't go off. There's not riots in the streets because the government isn't in command because all of that stuff is private sector anyway, right? But in China, every time we have a government shutdown in the United States, they put it in big headlines all over the country. Can you believe how dysfunctional the USA is? The government shut down. Because in China, if the government shut down, there would be riots in the streets, right? What would happen in China is this, let me put it this way. What would happen in the United States if our stock market tanked is what would happen in China if the government shut down. And what happens in the United States when the government shuts down, which, it's not good, but everything kind of moves ahead, it's kind of inconvenient, is what happens in China when the stock market tanks. In China, the government's in control, not the stock market. In the United States, the stock market is in control, not the government. That's the difference between capitalism and socialism. Are profits in command, or is the state in command, right? And it's not a question of private ownership versus public ownership. Saudi Arabia, for example, massive government ownership, but all the government does is ensure that wealth flows into the hands of the Saudi royal family, right? It's a profit-run economy. They have all kinds of problems with unemployment and all kinds, because the government, it owns everything, but it owns it for the purpose of making sure the royal family gets wealthy. The royal family hands out money to its friends like water. We know that, right? And that Saudis get benefits. They get benefits. And most of the country, about a third of the country, I should say, not most of the country, are guest worker slaves who have no rights, who get disappeared and beheaded and tortured and can't leave. And, I mean, it's Saudi Arabia is a capitalist economy with a huge amount of state involvement, but that state involvement simply facilitates wealth going into a few hands. We need to understand the difference between capitalism and socialism. And folks, if you're a tankie, if you're one of these people who defends, right, the USSR, maybe you're critical of it, but you say that it was indeed a socialist society. If you're one of those people that defends China and says, hey, I'm critical, not everything's great in China, but it was indeed a socialist society. If you defend Cuba, if you defend Venezuela, if you're one of the lefties that they call tankies, you need to get ready, folks, because you are going to be the center of the conversation. Basically, when they call Bernie Sanders a communist, they're calling him a tankie. And we've seen how Bernie Sanders reacts to being called a tankie. He goes, I'm not one of those. I mean, Hillary Clinton pulled that on him, right? And she said, he supported the Sandinistas, he supported Cuba. And he says, well, no, I just didn't think the USA should invade them. I don't. And he backs away. He backs away. That's what he does, right? And the conversation immediately goes to, that wasn't real socialism. He just wants Denmark. Socialism just means a welfare state. I surrender. But tankyism is going to be the center of debate pretty soon. As the Bernie Sanders stuff heats up, tankyism, and is it legit to be a tankie? Aren't tankies the same as Nazis? That kind of thing is going to be the center of debate. So if you're a tankie, you need to get ready. You need to get ready because the things that we as tankies believe are going to be the center of conversation. And let me also emphasize, don't be stupid. Don't be stupid, right? That clip of that, there's some Bernie Sanders guy that Project Veritas, the Fox News conservative outlet, got, and he's smoking, I think it's a joint. He's smoking his joint, and he's like, what do we do with people who don't agree with socialism? Gulag. People in lefty circles joke, they make jokes, but don't say something that'll get taken out of context, right? I am the first one to tell you the Soviet Union had big problems in terms of human rights. I am the first one to tell you that the socialist societies had difficulties in terms of human rights. I don't want, gulags from people who disagree with me, right? And that, we need to be real. We need to be real. Don't say something stupid, right? That can be taken out of context. Yeah, on the internet, it sounds real nice to be like, yeah, Stalin should have killed more people. Come on. Don't say that kind of thing, right? Because to the average people, that sounds pretty horrendous. And it's not responsible. Don't talk that way. Don't do it, right? Don't go there, right? You might be making a joke to your tanky friends, but to other people that sounds really vicious. And there's no reason. We can point out why the socialist countries had to be authoritarian, or why they did become authoritarian. It was because they were surrounded. They were in a state of all-out war. The Soviet Union was invaded by 15 different countries in the 1920s. It was invaded by the Nazis, and 26 million people died. The Soviet Union was an authoritarian society out of necessity, right? And the same, North Korea is a very authoritarian place, but it's like that because it's locked down and at war with the rest of the world, basically. The USA has never ended the Korean War. The USA killed like 4 or 5 million Koreans during the Korean War. That country is locked down, military first, and there's no reason to defend that and say that's an ideal way of being. No socialist society is an ideal. These are all countries that have been kept in poverty by Western capitalism. They have been kept in poverty by Western capitalism, and they are trying to survive. And they have adopted socialist methods to raise themselves out of poverty. That's what socialism in the 20th century basically was. It was countries like Russia, countries like China, countries like Angola, countries like Zimbabwe, countries like Cuba, countries like Nicaragua, adopting socialist methods to break out of the Western system that was keeping them poor and start raising their people out of poverty with a centrally planned economy. And they achieved that in many, many ways. What was achieved by China is one of the greatest stories in human history. If you look at what China was in the 50s versus what China is today, that is a miracle. And that would not have happened under the free market. It was because society came together and controlled the means of production that China has what it has today. Without the Communist Party, there would be no new China, right? The Communist Party used market mechanisms in the 50s. They used all-out state control in the 60s and 70s. They moved back toward more market mechanisms in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Now, they're moving a little bit closer to more state control. It's a back and forth. They do what works, right? at the end of the day, the Chinese Communist Party decides what they're going to do, not the corporations, right? You look at it. I mean, Cuba is just a tiny island, and people all over the world know them because they're medical volunteers, because they're literacy volunteers. I mean, the life expectancy and living conditions of Cubans are far better than people in Guatemala, people in so many countries throughout, people in Chile. I mean, you look at what Cuba has achieved, the way the average Cuban lives compared to the way people live in like the mountains of Honduras. I mean, it's unprecedented what they've achieved, and people just want to deny that. But that's the reality. I mean, what has been achieved for Cubans compared to what has been achieved in all these free market countries? What has been achieved in Haiti? Look at the living conditions in Haiti, where the free market runs rampant, NAFTA, right? All of this points to the fact that socialism, the state controlling the means of production, the banks, factories, and industries being forced by the state to operate for public good, that system has had big successes. And that system is the future. And capitalism is tearing apart the West. And I'm going to get to Trump and his State of the Union and the economics in there. But now I have some super chats to answer, right? I was asked 4 super chats were presented to me, and now I'm going to address those 4 super chats. The first was, what books do I recommend on the history of Russia? Well, one book that I do recommend that I learned a huge amount from, I will tell you, was called The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Short Course. And that is a history of Bolshevism, a history of the people that ended up running Russia from 1917 up until 1991. But it starts way before that. It goes back to the origins of the Russian Revolutionary Movement, and it was the official textbook. And Stalin actually wrote a lot of it, I believe. Oh, goodness gracious. What a day, folks. What a day. Stalin wrote a great deal of that book. The section on dialectical materialism, I think, was written by Stalin. The section on dialectical materialism was written by Stalin. And it's an interesting book. People argue that it's, quote unquote, propaganda. And I mean, it was published in 1936, I believe. And it was the Soviet Communist Party speaking for itself. Obviously, it tells things from their point of view. But if you want to understand the history of Russian Marxism, that would be the book to check out. Now, in terms of the history, in terms of the country, one book that I learned a huge amount from was called The Stalin Era by Anna Louise Strong. Anna Louise Strong lived in the Soviet Union. She was an American journalist, and she lived there. She actually lived there, and it was great. It was fascinating. And she describes what went on. She describes the Great Terror, though. She describes the fear where people were turning each other in, and the gulags and all of that, right? I think that I recommend that book as well. I recommend Anna Louise Strong. What other history books do I recommend for Soviet history? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, there's many different books that you learn a lot about. There was an academic study called it was about a metal manufacturing factory. I can't remember the name of it, but I actually learned a lot about it because it studied one particular factory in St. Petersburg, Petrograd. There was this factory that did metal, right? And it studies this factory and what it was like in the 19 teens, before the Russian Revolution, what it was like in the 20s, what it was like in the 30s, what it was like in the 50s. That was fascinating, and it kind of gives the life story of different people who worked in it. It's a particular study of one particular factory in the USSR. I thought that was fascinating. It's a very, very good read. What else do I recommend in terms of Soviet history? There's a lot of good stuff written about Soviet history. I could come up with a comprehensive list, but overall, there are many, many different titles. I've always gotten a lot out of Anna Louise Strong, right? And her autobiography, I Change Worlds, is very powerful. I recommend it. But there's some other stuff that came out during that time period as well. There's a lot of memoirs, autobiographies of like Americans who lived there. That was very good. One book that's fascinating, and it's an interesting one, and it's written not by a communist, but there was a British couple, a very, very wealthy British couple that were key in the British Labour Party, and they were not communists. They were social democrats. But in the 1930s, they published a book called Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. And I think I have it here somewhere. Do I have that? Yeah. And this book, Soviet Communism, it's in 2 volumes, right? Soviet Communism, A New Civilization by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, right? And it's in 2 volumes. And it's basically as social democrats, as members of the Fabian Society, so definitely not revolutionaries, they published this 2-volume study. This 2-volume study of what the Soviet economy was like. And they studied the economy, they studied the Soviet legal system and how it worked, they studied it's fascinating. And they're critical, and they just talk about it. Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, Volume 1 and Volume 2 by Sidney and Beatrice Webb. I recommend it, right? Again, they're going to give their perspective. But you have to remember that in the 1930s, right, when the world capitalist market was having a Great Depression, there was a lot that was published. A lot was published about the Soviet system. Roosevelt sent his economic advisors over to the Soviet Union to study what they were doing. Mussolini, right, and the fascists, they studied what the Soviet Union was doing. Mussolini had a theory. He claimed the Soviet Union was not socialist. It was, quote, super capitalism. Right? Read about this. Mussolini had this whole theory about, well, the Soviet Union, yeah, their economy is booming, but it's super capitalism, and it was, everyone was kind of in awe of what the Soviets were doing, and they all had different interpretations of it. What Roosevelt did with the Works Progress Administration was largely inspired by the Soviet Union, right? One of the key things the Soviet Union did in order to facilitate economic growth was they built hydroelectrical power plants. Right? There was no nuclear power back in the 1930s, right? And coal power existed, but they needed that coal for metal manufacturing and other things. So they built huge hydroelectrical power plants, all right? The Dnieper Dam, right? That brought electricity to almost all of Ukraine, right? Well, the Dnieper Dam, was very much, that was kind of a huge technological achievement because it brought so much electricity and it used harnessing a river. That's what hydroelectrical power is. You're using the current of a river to generate electricity, to turn turbines to generate electricity. So, based on that, seeing that hydroelectrical power plants were a cutting-edge way to develop electricity, Roosevelt, and the Works Progress Administration did that all across the United States. And there was the rural electrification project was one of the big successes of the 1930s Roosevelt economic expansion and the building of infrastructure. So yeah, there's a lot of books that I would recommend about the history of the Soviet Union, right? All kinds of stuff I would recommend. The history, this is the official history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This is the Red Star Publishers edition of it. And this is, if you want to understand where the Bolshevik movement came from, what they believed, it goes into the fights they had in the 1920s with the Trotskyites, with the workers' opposition, all the way up into 1936. I recommend The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, short course. I recommend Anna Louise Strong. I recommend Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Yeah, there are many different titles I would recommend. There's a lot to read out there. I actually really enjoyed this particular book. Now, this is called 6 Months in Red Russia, and it was written by Louise Brandt. I don't know if people have ever read Louise Brandt. Now, Louise Brandt was the wife of John Reed. John Reed wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. That was an account of the Russian Revolution. He was living in Russia, an American journalist, and it was a history of the Russian Revolution as he witnessed it, as it was happening. And it was recommended by Lenin. But right after the Russian Revolution, and the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, his spouse, Louise Brandt, who was a journalist, she wrote this actually fascinating book, 6 Months in Red Russia. And in it, she gets into biographies of Russian revolutionaries, not just Bolsheviks, but left socialist revolutionary party members like anarchists. And she gives you a lot of portraits. You get to learn, she does a lot of interviews with people. It's more of a journalistic account of what things were like. That's very fascinating. And at the time, the Americans were largely smearing the Bolsheviks as being agents of the Germans, right? Well, this is Germany conquered Russia. That's why Russia pulled out of World War I. And she interviews a lot of those folks about what the attitude of the Bolshevik government toward the Kaiser in Germany actually was. Fascinating stuff, folks. Fascinating stuff. There's a lot that I could recommend. There's a book on how national minorities were treated, right? right? This is called Soviet but Not Russian. This is a very good book, right? Because, Russian is one nationality, but the Soviet Union had many different nationalities within it, right? They at one point until I believe the Second World War, they had this thing called the House of Nationalities, and it was like our Senate, where every nationality, including Jews, including Ukrainians, including Kazakhs, whoever, they all had a seat in this House of Nationalities, so they were all equally represented. And now many people think that the Soviet Union went too far with that, right? I mean, I know Vladimir Putin and others have said that kind of the emphasis on nationalities may have played a role in eventually dividing the Soviet Union. So that's particularly fascinating. I mean, there's a lot that was written. I wonder if I have a copy of it here, because I do. Somebody mentioned it in the comments. I really do mention. I'm really fascinated by. There is a particular book that's very, very good. It's called Socialism Betrayed by Roger Kieran. And that is very good. And if you can watch Roger Kieran's lectures about it, I would recommend it. Roger Kieran is an American academic and scholar. And at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, he wrote a book about what happened in the Soviet Union. Why did it happen? Right? And he went into great detail investigating the fall of the Soviet Union. And he wrote this book. Roger Kieran, this academic, wrote this book, Socialism Betrayed. And it's a very, very good book. And it goes into great depth examining why the Soviet Union fell. I recommend, Socialism Betrayed by Roger Kieran. There's a lot of things you can learn. And remember, you don't have to agree with everything you read, right? Sometimes you read Anna Louise Strong. She's so in awe of what the Soviet Union is doing, she overlooks some of the shortcomings that they had, right? I mean, you read some of these other things, like that book I mentioned earlier, on the metal factory, right? This is it. It's by Kevin Murphy, right? Revolution and Counter-Revolution. A class struggle in a Moscow metal factory, not St. Petersburg, like I said, but Moscow. This is the book I was mentioning before. I didn't know if I had it there on the shelf or not. I recommend it. It's a good book. I don't agree with a lot of the content in here. He's trying to, at some points, he seems very influenced by Trotskyism, but I like it. I learned a lot from it. I learned about how the Soviet Union changed and how this particular metal factory was affected. I learned from this book. It's a good book. Do I agree with everything in it? No. Just because you hold up a book doesn't mean that you endorse all the content of it, right? I don't agree with Sidney and Beatrice Webb about a lot of stuff. I don't agree with the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union about a lot of stuff. You should read everything critically. But if you want to understand the other side of the story, and that's the thing, if you go into an American university and you study Russian history or Soviet history, you're going to read Robert Conquest. And you're going to hear that the Soviet Union was pure hell on earth from the moment it was created until the moment it was overthrown. And ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has just been happy ever since, until Putin showed up and ruined everything again. You're going to get this narrative that just it feeds into things, and it ignores huge economic achievements. It ignores, you're going to get a narrative of basically personal anecdotes about Stalin doing bad things. And that is not an explanation of what actually went on in Soviet history. It's not. Now, to be fair, everyone agrees. Everyone agrees. Everyone agrees. Let me say this one more time. Everyone agrees that during the Great Terror, the Yezhov Shina, that there were a lot of people who were politically repressed who should not have been, right? And even the most staunch defender of Stalin will tell you that what happened 1936, 1937, the period of the Moscow trials, a lot of people were turned in by their neighbors. There was this police state. There was the secret police arresting lots of people, and a lot of innocent people were caught up in stuff that was really wrong, right? And that, they talk about people in the Soviet Union having apartments where they were, these people had been living in huts before with no running water and electricity. Now they're living in modern apartments, but they're sharing a bathroom with like 4 other families, and there's a disagreement, and it happened. People turned each other in falsely. There was a great fear among the population that and bad things happened, right? And you don't want to gloss over that, right? Anna Louise Strong was living there, and she describes it as a state of mass fear, mass hysteria about Nazi spies and about Trotskyite wreckers and infiltrators, and that there were, I mean, there's no need to gloss over this. There's no reason to say that everyone who was in the gulags deserved it, because there were clearly lots and lots of people who were unnecessarily repressed and were repressed horrendously. And there's no reason to gloss over that. There's no reason to deny the fact that in the 1920s there were huge famines, right? Because there was a blockade, and you know, the country was blockaded, and you know, it was very difficult for them to get, you know, medical aid and medical assistance, and they were trying to get the agricultural system going, and that was a mess. There's no reason to deny there was a huge famine in Ukraine in the early 1930s. There's no reason to deny that that took place. Now it's one thing to say that there was a huge famine, which there was, and all kinds of people starved to death, and it was horrendous. But it's another thing to say that was, you know, an intentional genocide. That's a very different thing to say. And furthermore, you have to point out that who was it who mechanized agriculture in the Soviet Union? They didn't have tractors in rural areas until the Soviet Union came along, right? I mean, it was because of socialism that these problems were solved, right? The food crises of mass malnutrition happened in Russia all the time for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was the Soviet system that modernized and electrified Russia and made it a modern country where that didn't happen, right? It was the Soviet Union that cured Russia of these crises of famine and malnutrition. No one ever talks about that. Are there things that happened along the way to that were horrendous? Yes, okay. And is the Soviet government completely blameless, right? You know, is it all the fault of foreign actors? No. I'm sure there are decisions that they made that if we had been there ourselves, we would have done things differently. Or we like to think that. We don't even know. Look, I'm going to move on from this topic. I feel like I've given quite a sufficient answer. But let me end. I'll end with this point that I've made many, many, many times. Right? In the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, of the October Revolution, 1917, right? The Bolsheviks take power in the October Revolution, November by our calendar. They take power, and immediately people are celebrating. And they're cheering and drinking, and they're celebrating and partying. Yes, the old regime has been overthrown. The war, we're going to end the war. World War I, we're pulling out of the war. There was a lot of drinking and partying. And of course, the forces that wanted to overthrow the Bolsheviks were convening and taking power, right? And setting up their army to go and invade St. Petersburg and invade the major cities where the Bolsheviks had taken power. But all these people were drinking and partying. So the Bolshevik army confiscated all the alcohol in major centers. And then they instituted the death penalty for drinking alcohol. They instituted the death penalty for drinking alcohol. If you were caught drinking alcohol, you were shot. Folks, I cannot ever imagine being in a situation where I would shoot someone for drinking alcohol. That's horrendous. But it was a military situation, right? Millions of lives were on the line. They had just seized power. They forcibly conscripted all the men, and they instituted the death penalty for drinking alcohol. And people got shot for disobeying orders and for drinking alcohol because it was a military situation. It was kill or be killed. And they had to institute that level of authoritarianism. I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do. I'm telling you what happened. That's awful. I cannot ever, ever, ever in my life imagine being in a situation where I would shoot someone for drinking alcohol. But that's when you're in a state of war. When a country is in a state of all-out war, fighting for its life, things become really, really authoritarian really, really quickly. That's the reality, folks. And we can't relate to that. We cannot relate to that kind of situation. A military situation where they're shooting people for drinking alcohol in order to enforce the most rigid military discipline to defeat another army. The country's in a state of civil war, right? And that wasn't Stalin that did that. That was Lenin, that was Trotsky, that was just after the Russian Revolution. They're in a situation where they're on military lockdown. The Soviet government has been created, and it's fighting for its life, and it institutes that level of authoritarianism. Is that an ideal? Of course not, right? In the 1930s, 50s, people were drinking alcohol all over the USSR. But that was the situation they were in the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution. And that needs to be understood. That the harsh conditions that these people were in, the harsh, extreme circumstances that created the Russian Revolution, are something we can't really understand. It is beyond our comprehension. But the fact is they got out of those harsh circumstances. They did. And they industrialized the entire country. They electrified the entire country. They wiped out illiteracy. They created a massive steel industry and a massive, manufacturing. They gave people running water and electricity all over the whole country. They created the first spacecraft, right? They created huge achievements in art and science. And the fact that they got from those dark situations right after the Russian Revolution to what they became by the 1950s and 60s is nothing short of a miracle. And that reality, that the Soviet Union went from being an impoverished agrarian country with next to nothing on the verge of civil war, it got from there to being a global industrial superpower. That shows that socialism and socialist methods of organizing the economy work. That's all you should take from it, folks. There's no reason to glorify it. There's no reason to say that every decision they made was correct. But the fact that they were able to take a country from being a backward agrarian country to being what it is today is nothing short of a miracle. And it points toward the fact that socialist methods work. Socialist methods do work. With a state-controlled planned economy, you can raise people out of poverty, you can abolish illiteracy, you can have economic growth with socialism. And they did it. And that's what we should take from it. That's it. That's it. Don't romanticize it. Don't say that that's the best system, because it wasn't, right? It was what they could do at that time. It was circumstances we can't relate to, but it accomplished tremendous, amazing results, right? And that shows that we don't have to have capitalism. If Russia can go from being what it was in 1917 to what it was by 1960, that in and of itself is proof that capitalism is not the only alternative. We don't need the rule of profits, right? Margaret Thatcher says that socialism doesn't work because you eventually run out of other people's money. Well, if all they had done in Russia in 1917 was redistribute money or wealth that was already there, they would have stayed dirt poor. Socialism creates wealth because it rationally organizes production. That's a fact. The Soviet Union proved it. China has proved it. Other countries have proved it. That this notion that the government never, we have to have the market in command, we have to have profits in command because that's the only way, it's human nature, blah, blah, blah. All this BS we've heard is false. The Soviet experience proves that. It also proves a lot of bad things happen. So this is what you should take from it. And that's why I have to be a Tankie. Because the entire conversation in the United States is premised on a lie. I'm sorry, the entire conversation in the United States is premised on a lie. I have heard my whole life the Soviet Union never produced anything. The Soviet Union never, okay, Peter Kropotkin, I will get to that, all right? The Soviet Union never accomplished anything. The Soviet Union, everyone was just poor and starving and miserable the whole time. I'm sorry. I mean, the Soviet steel industry, the Soviet space program, the Soviet military manufacturing, they accomplished some real miracles. And if you can't acknowledge that, you can't talk about socialism, because the entire conversation in the United States, from Bernie Sanders all the way to Donald Trump, is predicated on this notion that socialism cannot create economic growth. That's false. That's false. So I hope that answered the question. That first super chat I got was asking me about Russia and Russian history. I hope I have sufficiently answered your question. And as many people have pointed out in the comments, if you want to read about the Soviet Union and socialist economics and 21st century socialism, what we've learned from it, you got to read my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. because there's a whole section on here on the Soviet Union and what it's accomplished, on really existing socialism. Order my book now. Get your own copy of it. I've got a whole bunch of stuff in here about Soviet economics. I cite all kinds of people like W.B. Du Bois and United Nations statistics. So if you really want to learn my perspective on this, having read all that stuff I just showed you and having traveled around the world and read my book. Order my book today. Product placement, right? So there you go. I recommend it if you really want to understand my view of things and lots of data and statistics to back it up. Read this. So on that note, coronavirus. All right. So I'm going to answer that question. But here's the thing. Now, I interviewed, as you all saw, I interviewed somebody who's in Shanghai right now and was describing what was going on. Good, longtime friend of mine, Polish fellow, Polish-American, Peter Stolorski, great guy. Yeah, I interviewed him. But I'm going to be interviewing a China expert very soon. I have an interview scheduled with, folks will remember, Wen Hongyu, right? He gave a great presentation, Introduction to Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. It went viral, thousands of views. Right? He's a lawyer and attorney here in New York City, expert on Chinese communism, has studied this stuff in both English and Chinese, has been translating, has actually translated writings and speeches by Chinese military figures and such. Great guy. He and I are going to have a YouTube chat very soon. Automobiles under communism. All right. We're going to have a chat very soon about coronavirus and everything that's going on, and you will hear it from the expert. So stay tuned. It'll be online very soon. Wen Hong and I are going to have a YouTube conversation about all of that. All right. So we've talked about the first super chat about Russian history. We talked about coronavirus. Bernie presidency. All right. First of all, folks, please tweet this out. Please share this conversation. We need more people here. We need this to be a bigger chat. The more people that are here, the more fun we're going to have. Please share this. Please bring all your friends. Spread the word. Make this a bigger conversation. The more the merrier, right? It's Sunday afternoon. What else? Who has anything better to do than listen to me, right? I'm joking, of course. I know there's other things you could do, but hey, I'm happy that you're here. You all make this happen. Hit that like button. Hit that subscribe button. So the next question I got was about Bernie Sanders, and could a Bernie Sanders presidency, could that actually, liven up and encourage the socialist movement in the United States? And the answer to that is yes, right? If Bernie Sanders is actually able to get elected, the young people that have poured into his rallies, the young people, I saw them out in my neighborhood today. I gave a thumbs up there were 2 people that were walking up and down the street in my neighborhood with Bernie buttons on. Good for them, right? They're campaigning for someone they agree with. I don't endorse any candidate. But yes, I could see the mass movement around Bernie Sanders becoming even more empowered. Yes, I could absolutely see that. I could see them getting stronger. However, there's a danger, too, and I pointed this out. If Bernie Sanders were to get into office and be unable to accomplish anything, I could see that destroying the socialist movement in the United States. I could see people in the United States just thinking that socialism, well, we tried that. Look, we had the Bernie presidency and nothing changed and things got worse, So, the Obama effect, right? The Obama effect. Let's talk about that. The Obama presidency was the most demoralizing thing that has ever happened to the millennial generation, right? I remember I was there crying and screaming and, oh my God, it was Bernie, it was Obama. And Obama made things worse. Why do you think there were chaos, there was protests and chaos in Baltimore? Why do you think Black Lives Matter happened? Because the hopes of the Obama administration were very largely disappointed. And a lot of the cynicism, people really believed that Obama was going to be the savior, and he wasn't. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that was made by the socialist groups I was hanging out in is we didn't endorse Obama, but there was this kind of don't criticize Obama, be optimistic about Obama. I remember Amy Goodman, the Democracy Now! Person. I saw her speak right after Obama was elected. And she said, it's so great that Obama has been elected because he's a community organizer. And because the president is a community organizer, parents are going to tell their kids to be activists and be community organizers. No, they didn't. Everyone was, we knew Obama. I mean, Obama was from the beginning. I mean, his family connection to the coup in Indonesia, you go down the line, Obama was awful, right? Libya, Syria. I mean, come on. You know, Obama was awful. But there was this feeling among socialists in the United States that we had to pretend to be optimistic about Obama. We couldn't be honest, right? The right wing called Obama a communist and a socialist, and we couldn't say no, he's not. Furthermore, it was the opposite with Trump, right? It's pretty clear the establishment was not happy that Trump won, and Trump said some non-interventionist things. We couldn't have any. I mean, it was awful, right? Sometimes you have to be a voice crying out in the wilderness, right? You know, I am all for trying to be popular and win people over, but there are times where you have to do the opposite of that. There are times where you have to be real. You have to be real with people. You have to tell it like it is, and people won't like to hear it in the moment. They won't like to hear it in the moment, but they'll respect you later, right? And the way the socialist movement in the United States responded to Obama was problematic, right? They needed to be, you know, there were some groups that were, you know, like there was one group that did this gimmick with like Obama Kool-Aid, and that was offensive, right? There's no need to get offensive. But at the same time, you know, you can recognize it was a huge accomplishment for African Americans. You can recognize that for many African Americans, they felt very empowered, that, you know, their child could grow up and believe that he was president of the United States. But you had to point out that Obama was not a socialist. You had to point out that Obama was not a Marxist, that Obama worked for the system. I mean, but there was this feeling that we had to join the enthusiasm, and that was a mistake. It was a big mistake. Furthermore, we'd made the exact, I mean, you look at the socialist movement, they made the exact opposite mistake with Trump, right? Trump said he was going to stop meddling around the world and overthrowing regimes, right? And was hated for it. Trump was accused of being a Russian supporter, right? I mean, Trump said he was going to build infrastructure, right? So, you know, there was this blind, you know, we're going to try our hardest to find something good about Obama, and we can't acknowledge anything remotely good about it. Was stupid, right? That the problem is a lot of Marxist groups, they operate only in urban areas and major cities, and they're tied in with labor union activism, and they're tied in with Democratic Party activism. And even if they don't endorse the Democrats, they have this weird relationship with the Democratic Party wing of the bourgeoisie, and they don't think rationally. And you know, it's important to sometimes speak real. Malcolm X, right? Many of Malcolm X's speeches, you listen to them. What is Malcolm X saying? He says, I know you're not going to like what I'm saying, but here's how it is. A lot of times you listen to Malcolm X, he's saying things that he knows his audience doesn't want to hear, right? He's saying things he knows his audience doesn't want to hear, but they need to hear, right? And that sometimes you have to be a voice crying out in the wilderness. Sometimes you have to be a voice crying out in the wilderness. And with Bernie, I do think that, you know, if Bernie were victorious, that would empower socialists in the United States, but it has the potential to do the opposite, right? If Bernie were to get into office and do nothing, that would have the potential to be far more demoralizing than Obama was. Obama didn't pretend to be a socialist, right? Obama wasn't a community organizer, right? We know, right? And that stuff like this happens, right? Detroit is a great example. Detroit in the 1970s, you know, had a very revolutionary atmosphere, right? I mean, the mayor, Coleman Young of Detroit, I mean, he was like mayor of Detroit from like the 70s up into like the early 90s. He had been around the Communist Party USA and had been friendly with the Communist Party USA, had been in like, I think he'd been associated with one of the like Maoist breakaways, right? Coleman Young, there was a communist judge who was elected, and Detroit had this radical atmosphere, this very radical atmosphere in the 70s, right? It was the one city where the new communist movement had significant power, right? I mean, in terms of elections and stuff. I mean, the Maoist, you know, the 70s communist movement, they had power in Detroit. And the banks declared war on Detroit because of that. And they've closed all the factories. The factories are closing down across the United States, but it was in Detroit that they closed them first. And they made Detroit synonymous with poverty, with crime, and they said, look, that's what happens when black radicals and communists run a city. And that was very demoralizing. I mean, there's some great organizers in Detroit doing great work, but in Detroit, because they had that kind of radical leadership in the 70s, 80s, and 80s, and because they became very, very poor, mainly as a result of that, that's been very demoralizing, right? And that happens, right? I mean, there's other examples of this, right? When Dennis Kucinich was mayor of Cleveland, right? He was the boy mayor, the youngest mayor they'd ever had, and he stood up and he did some radical stuff, and refused to privatize the power company. And the banks declared war on the city, and I mean, this kind of thing happens. And if progressive leaders take power, but they don't have the ability to actually implement their program, they just kind of stand there, and the population doesn't really have their back, and they aren't able to actually exercise power, it can lead to big problems. There's many examples of that. I mean, nothing was more demoralizing than what happened to Salvador Allende, right? I mean, the scars and wounds of what happened in Chile in the 1970s, I mean, go on and on and on. And he was elected, he was popular, but, the military toppled him, and again, I mean, people know that it's Pinochet's coup and all of that caused all that problem, but that's demoralizing, right? And that it's complicated. Now, people are saying, isn't that the story of AMLO? Too soon to tell, right? We don't know, right? There are times where radicals will take office and they're powerless and they're weak and things get worse. And there are times where radicals take office on a very moderate platform and suddenly things speed full force ahead and things change, right? You don't know, right? If Bernie Sanders were elected, in the initial stage, immediately, it would have the possibility of really strengthening the socialist movement, and then what happened next would depend on what he was actually able to accomplish. Yes, if Bernie Sanders was elected and gave everyone free healthcare, gave everyone free college, ended the student debt crisis, started a mass infrastructure program, pulled off some of the Roosevelt-style stuff, and was preaching socialism from the White House. If Bernie Sanders came into power and was really strong, if Bernie Sanders came into power and was strong as steel, that would be the best thing that could ever happen for American socialism. However, if Bernie Sanders came into power and was weak as, I don't know, balsa wood, that would be like the worst thing that could possibly happen to the socialist movement. And I'm probably not winning any points for saying that. First of all, folks know I don't agree with Bernie about foreign policy, right? His foreign policy stuff now. Maybe I agree with some of his foreign policy from the 80s, but his foreign policy stuff now is not my viewpoint, right? I'm an actual socialist. He's very clear he doesn't want actual socialism. He wants welfare state reform. I'm not endorsing Bernie. I'm just telling you, I was asked what the implications of Bernie's presidency could be for American socialism. They could be very good, and they would be very good immediately. In the immediate aftermath, the long-term result would depend on what Bernie Sanders actually accomplished. How's that? All right, that handles that super chat. All right, China and Howie Hawkins. Howie Hawkins is a nice guy. I've met him. He's running for the Green Party nomination for president, and he's very critical of China, but I don't know much about, I guess he went there or something. Don't know much about it, but thank you for the super chat. Peter Kropotkin, who I have his book here somewhere, right? Peter Kropotkin was the father of Russian anarchism. And, in Russia, so this is the whole thing. And actually, that's why you should read this book, right? The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. You'll learn all this. In Russia, right, you had a czar, right? An autocratic feudal monarchy. And as all over Europe, 1848, you had the Spring of Nations, the rise of nation states. There were people in Russia who wanted to have some kind of revolutionary movement. The first grouping that existed were called the Constitutional Democrats, and it was cadets. And they just wanted a democratic republic, right? They wanted Russia to become the United States or to have a parliament like the UK or whatever. That was the first current, right? They were the Constitutional Democrats. They favored, elections. Then you had what was called the Narodniks, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, folks. So the Narodniks. Narodnik means peopleists. People translate it as populists, but that's not exactly a correct pronunciation. The Narodniks. And the Narodniks Sometimes it's translated as friends of the people. They believe that the Russian peasantry, the folks in rural areas, should rise up and seize control of their land, right? And they were greatly influenced by what was happening in Europe at that time. Let's remember the peasant revolts in Germany, the rural uprisings in France. I mean, Napoleon was heavily influenced by that. Not Napoleon, Beethoven was heavily influenced by the peasant uprisings. And that in the struggle against feudalism, peasant uprisings were very key, right? Peasants would say, I'm sick and tired of, being basically a semi-slave of a landlord. I want to have my own land. Peasant uprisings as the basis for a revolution. That was the Narodniks, the friends of the people, the peopleists, right? The Narodniks. Peter Kropotkin was the big Narodnik, and that's what he believed. He believed that the peasants of Russia would rise up and seize their land, and they would, instead of having individual land, they would have communes. He believed that the goal of the Russian Revolution was to establish rural communes. He was very wealthy. He was from a very wealthy background, and I believe he actually set up some rural communes and bought it, right? But he was a revolutionist. He was a radical, and that was Peter Kropotkin. And Mao Zedong was heavily influenced by Peter Kropotkin. At the time of the Russian Revolution, Mao was not a communist or a Marxist. He was part of something called the New People's Study Society, or the New People's Study Group, and that organization, they studied the writings of Peter Kropotkin, right? And that Peter Kropotkin, he was the peasant organizer. He was for the peasantry. He believed the revolution would come from the peasantry. That was Peter Kropotkin. That's who he was. And the Narodniks, that was what they're about. And anarchism is what they're associated with. And that's interesting, right? Nowadays, anarchists are associated with all kinds of different stuff, but until like the Second World War, the difference between communists and anarchists was communists organized factory workers, anarchists organized peasants. In Spain, that's the difference. The Spanish Civil War, right? The communists ran trade unions and the anarchists organized peasant uprisings. That was the difference, right? And that political terms take different connotations in different times. Anarchism, for a lot of anarchism's history, was radicals and revolutionaries who want to organize peasants to rise up and kill their landlords, whereas communists wanted to organize labor unions and factories, right? There was another current in Russia called the terrorists, and they were disappointed with the failure of Kropotkin and Narodnikism, and they thought that terrorism and violent acts of adventurism were the right thing to do. And Bolshevism, Marxism, came to Russia. It was the third revolutionary movement that came to Russia. First you had the Narodniks, then you had the terrorists. Marxism was the third incarnation of Russian radicalism, and Marxism said factory workers would make the revolution, right? And the father of Russian Marxism, I'm trying to remember his name. He was the father of Russian Marxism. He established the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. He was kind of a mentor to Lenin, but that was what made the Marxists of Russia different than the terrorists, different than the Narodniks, different than the constitutional Democrats. They believed in factory workers. And it's fascinating because the Chinese Revolution was a peasant revolution. So you have to wonder, if Mao had been talking the way he did and doing what Mao eventually did in Russia, he would have been with Peter Kropotkin. He wouldn't have been with the Bolsheviks. It's pretty wild. But there you go. That's who Peter Kropotkin is. And I hope that answers your question, Space Communist. Automobiles in communism. What is there to say about it? The United Auto Workers Union, the struggle to unionize the automobile manufacturing plants, that was very much, communist-led. There's a great book by Roger Kieran, the same guy who wrote Socialism Betrayed. He wrote a great study of communists and the auto workers' unions. I have it here somewhere. It's actually a fascinating study. We go back to the 1920s, 19-teens. Communists were always trying to organize auto workers. In the Soviet Union, they produced automobiles, right? I've heard many times right-wing people insist that no one had cars in the Soviet Union. False. There were plenty of cars, right? There was state car manufacturing in the Soviet Union. In China right now, they have a lot of private car companies, but they're basically controlled by the government, like all the private companies. They can do kind of what they want. People make profits, but the government shows up and says you're going to do that, and that's why China's pushing electric cars. Personally, I think, cars are good, right? People ought to have the right to a car, but I think that we're too in love with cars in the United States, right? Instead of having a national interstate highway system, we should have a train system, for goodness sakes, right? And I talked about that, right? And my whole thing on death economy, I talked about how the decision to get rid of our railroads and replace them with an interstate highway system was a big mistake. Trains are far less dangerous. There are far fewer train accidents than there are car accidents, right? Furthermore, cars are worse for the environment. It's fossil fuels, it's oil. Trains are more efficient. And China, because of what they've done in terms of train technology, I mean, we ought to have high-speed railway connecting the United States, clearly. I mean, I think we should have high-speed railway all the way from Alaska down to Chile, down to Argentina, right? I mean, we should have intercontinental trains, I mean, we should be able to get on a train and go to China from San Francisco. I think that'd be great, trains, they're not profitable for big oil companies, right? It's electricity. It's not fossil fuels. Oh boy, can't have that, right? The big oil companies have way too much power in the United States. In Europe, they've got great trains, not as good as China's trains. They got great trains. China's making the fastest trains in the world. It's really great what they're doing, and that's because, it's a rationally planned economy. So I hope that answers the question about automobiles. What else is on people's minds, folks? Be sure to tweet us out. Be sure to share this. Let's make this a bigger conversation. We're talking about all kinds of things. I got all kinds of stuff to talk about. I'm going to drink some more unnamed diet beverage. What's on people's minds, folks? What is on your mind? Got a few more things to talk about. Sinn Féin, right? The Fenians, right? Sinn Féin is the Irish Freedom Party, right? That's the party that was the legal wing of the IRA. They won big in the elections last night. Historic surge. I mean, no one saw it coming. Mary Lou McDonald is their new leader. Jerry Adams has stepped down, and she seems to have figured something out, right? There's talk of a referendum on a united Ireland taking place. Sinn Féin no longer backs armed struggle. Right? They honor the Good Friday Agreement, but at the same time, folks, there is underlying it. And you listen to Sinn Féin, they are economic socialists, they are Irish nationalists, they're for a united socialist Ireland, 36 counties. Exciting stuff. Didn't see it coming. And Mary Lou McDonald, I've been listening to her speeches. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Does Sinn Féin support the EU? They do not. They are considered to be a Eurosceptic party, but they're soft Eurosceptics. I mean, they're not harsh Eurosceptics, but basically because of Brexit, they're talking about a united Ireland referendum, and Scottish independence is now back on the table. There's probably going to be another Scottish independence referendum as well, because of what has happened. So, and Sinn Féin, they're economically left. They're for a united Ireland. They're very pro-Palestinian, very pro-Palestinian. You listen to Sinn Féin talk; they are not supporters of Israel at all. Quite an interesting development. But yeah, what else is on people's minds? I wanted to talk, earlier I talked about Venezuela. In Venezuela now the crisis is abating. And things in Venezuela are starting to move in kind of a more, a more better situation, right? Economically, things are developing better. Good, right? What do I think about? Sami wants me to talk about the Workers' Party of Britain. I'm very excited about it. I'm a big fan of George Galloway. I like George Galloway a lot. I know folks in the CPG-BML. They're great folks. I had a great interview with Jyoti Brar. They're great folks, and they're doing something exciting, right? They're rejecting identity politics. They're building a populist socialist party that is anti-EU, right? I mean, they're moving in the direction the left needs to move in, right? This liberal identity politics cult, that has taken the place of the left. And I talk about this a lot in City Builders and Vandals because it's really confusing. What has gone on with the left in the 20th century? You need to read my book, right? And what the folks at the Workers' Party of Britain are doing is the cutting edge. We're going to see a lot more stuff like that, right? We are going to. I don't endorse the CPG-BML on everything, and they know that. They're good folks, though. I mean, in a lot of what they do, they defend the history of socialism. They're anti-imperialist. They're good folks, and they're doing something pretty exciting. I'm excited. I think Workers' Party of Britain is the cutting edge. I really do, and I'm really excited about what they're doing. If you want to understand my analysis of what has happened on the left and why the left seems so confused and everything seems weird, you really ought to read City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, because this book will give you an understanding of what's going on. It's a very complicated story, and it's not something so simple. But I would encourage you to give a read to this book, because this will help you understand what in the world is going on. But yes, folks, what else is on people's minds? What else is new, folks? People are asking about my upcoming book. I'm not going to say too much about it. It's a work in progress. Book number 2, as it has been called. I'm not going to say too much about it, but I'm working on it. Definitely not an autobiography. There are rumors that it's an autobiography. People are asking me to write an autobiography. I am not old enough to write an autobiography. When I'm 75 years old, I will write an autobiography. I'm not 75 years old. There will be some reminiscences in it, but it will not be an autobiography. But it'll be about what I've learned and what we as a society have learned in the past 10 years. That I can say. And there will be some key concepts within it. What else is new, folks? I want to talk about Africa. That's one thing I wanted to talk about. Folks, I don't know if you noticed, but Donald Trump has extended his travel ban, right? The travel ban that Donald Trump was famous for, right? Where there were 6 countries, happened to be Muslim countries, that he banned travel in. And when that happened, I wrote an article about what was actually going on, right? On the left, everyone screamed Islamophobia, and all of a sudden there were protests all over the airports, which isn't allowed, and no one could talk about what was actually going on. I wrote an article about what was actually going on. So when Trump instituted his travel ban, all those countries, Sudan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, all of those countries, Iran, are countries where there is conflict going on. Not so much in Iran, but they would like there to be conflict going on. And the U.S. intelligence agencies have a policy of rewarding people with visas. This has been blatantly admitted, right? And in the aftermath of the travel ban, the people opposing the travel ban were saying, look, there's this guy in Iraq who risked his life and saved, people from the United States, and now he's banned from traveling. It was pretty blatant what it was about, folks. Very, very blatant what was going on, right? That people get rewarded with visas. The understanding that the intelligence agencies have, intersectionality, I'll write it down. The understanding that the intelligence agencies have is that basically if you do the dirty work of the United States, we give you a visa to come to the United States, to move to the United States, move your family here. That's how it works. And there's been a little bit of a problem. For example, I don't know if people realize that in Libya, there was a father and a son who both worked for the United States as Islamic terrorists to topple the government of Gaddafi. And then they were given a visa to move to the United Kingdom. And then the son bombed Manchester and killed a whole bunch of people at a concert. Why? Because he was a jihadist. He was a Wahhabi. And that was his religion. He was very, very opposed to people seeing naked people dance or whatever. And so he committed a horrendous act of terrorism and killed a bunch of innocent people. And this was a guy who the U.S. or the UK intelligence agencies had rewarded for doing their dirty work in Libya with a visa. Another example, right? In the United States, we had the New York and New Jersey bombings. A fellow by the name of Ahmed Rahami committed a horrendous act of terrorism and did some bombings. Well, his father was somebody who had fought in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, done the dirty work of the United States, and got a visa. Kids came to the United States, grew up, and again, the Tsarnaev brothers, their parents were Islamic extremists in Chechnya who'd done the dirty work of the United States, worked against the Soviet Union, been used as, extremists to fight Russia and the USSR. Their kids, they came to the United States, their kids went crazy. And that this policy of the CIA giving people visas, right? It makes sense. It worked out a little bit better during the Cold War. Cuba, you fight Castro, we give you a visa, you come here, you're happy. But when the U.S. government has a policy like it does in Syria, like it does in Libya, like in Afghanistan, of working with jihadists and extremists and fanatical Wahhabi folks. Like in Iran, for example, they're funding Wahhabi separatists. You know, um, you know, those folks are very, very dangerous. And there's an understanding among some of our police, agencies and whatnot, that when we work with extremists in Sudan or extremists in Syria or extremists in Libya to topple governments, and we employ fanatical, violent Wahhabis with the Saudi ideology, the Osama bin Laden types, and then we give them visas, they come here and do problems and create problems, or their kids come here and create problems. So this was one of the weird instances where I was not completely opposed to what Trump did, right? I mean, I don't think we should hate Muslims. It's not, Islam is not the problem. The problem is the CIA working with Wahhabis and extremists. And the CIA, though, knows that bribe, that we will give you a visa to come to the United States, is like one of the best things they got. And Trump took it away from them in 6 countries. So the protests against it were clearly, it wasn't the people just randomly rising up, okay? It came from the top. And, maybe it was wrong. Maybe, I don't feel like, it's complicated. It's complicated, okay? I'm not endorsing the travel ban, but I'm telling you that the motivation for it was based on the fact that the U.S. intelligence agencies have a policy of bribing people with visas in all of these countries. There are active conflicts going on, and the CIA and the American intelligence reward these people with visas, and these people that get rewarded with visas are the kind of people that blow up the Manchester concerts, and they're the kind of people that do the New Jersey bombing, they're the kind of people that blow up the Boston Marathon. That the U.S. government has a policy of working with jihadists, and one of the ways they reward them is they give them visas, and that has caused us security concerns. That's what the so-called Muslim ban was really about. It wasn't hating Muslims. It was a fight over should we continue to reward extremists in conflict countries with visas. And I got a huge amount of flack for saying that. People got really upset with me. That's what it was really about. If it was a Muslim ban, they would have banned Saudi Arabia. They would have banned Indonesia. They would have banned Turkey. They didn't ban them. These are countries where there's an active fight going on, and people get visas for being good, obedient foot soldiers of the United States. And that's what was going on. And Trump, instituting his Muslim ban, that's what happened. Now, folks, the travel ban, I should say, not the Muslim ban, has been expanded now, right? On Friday, I believe, or earlier than that, it was expanded to include Nigeria, Eritrea, Kyrgyzstan, and some other countries. Now, that brings me to what I want to say about Africa. So Nigeria, folks, Nigeria is the top oil exporting country on the African continent. It has a massive population. Look at the size of Nigeria on the map versus how many people there. It's got a huge population, hundreds of millions of people. Nigeria is the top oil producing country in Africa. No country on the African continent exports more oil than Nigeria. Now, Libya did, but now Libya is blown to bits. Nigeria is the top oil exporting country on the African continent. And Nigeria is dirt poor. Right? Google Niger Delta region. That's where the oil is. The Niger Delta. That's where the oil is. Google it. Look at the pictures. The extreme poverty of Nigeria, the top oil exporting country on the African continent, is the greatest condemnation of capitalism. Right? If free trade made people wealthy, Nigeria would be wealthy. Nigeria has been having free trade, free investment with Western capitalism for decades, since the 50s. Chevron is there. Shell Oil is there. British Petroleum is there. Exxon Mobil is there. Huge amounts of oil is extracted from Nigeria. Nigeria has free trade with Western capitalism, like you would not believe. And Nigeria is dirt poor. There is massive illiteracy in Nigeria. There is massive, child labor in Nigeria. There is massive crises of malnutrition in Nigeria. If free trade and being open for business with Western capitalism made countries wealthy, Nigeria would be rich as hell. It's a huge oil exporting country. Nobody in Africa has more oil and is exporting more oil at this point than Nigeria. And Nigerians have a very low life expectancy. They have a very low rate of literacy. They don't have running water. They don't have electricity. It's a huge population, malnourished people. If capitalism was the answer, Nigeria or the US government just implemented a travel ban. They can't come here. Nigeria would be a very, very wealthy country. And it ain't. It ain't. It ain't. It ain't. It just isn't. It is not, to use proper English. Right? If free trade is the answer, if what you read in your stupid economics textbook in college about how markets empower people and free trade is the way, and sure, these people are poor, but the free market opens up. If any of that malarkey was true, Nigeria would be the richest country in Africa right now. Nigeria would have the highest life expectancy in Africa right now. Nigeria would have the highest rate of literacy in Africa right now. And it doesn't. Nigeria is deeply poor and deeply rich at the same time. It is rich in natural resources. It's got a few billionaires even. And there's billions and billions of dollars that are being made for it, but they ain't being made by Nigerians. They are being made by Wall Street and London capitalists, right? The big four super major oil companies, they have the power there. And the environmental situation is pretty horrendous. You know, look at some of these pictures from the Niger Delta region. Children playing on beaches that are stained black with oil because oil spills happen all the time. Talk about certain parts of the Niger Delta region. It's never dark at night. It's never dark at night. Never dark at night. Why? Because there's oil fires all the time. Right? The fumes that people breathe. I mean, it's... If you want to see the success of the free market, visit the Niger Delta region and see the fact that one of the most prosperous, the most blessed places in the earth in terms of natural resources is the site of some of the most horrendous poverty you've ever seen. That's capitalism. The USA has just instituted a travel ban against Nigeria. And what's interesting also, you know, there's a whole history of like civil wars and conflicts in Nigeria, right? There was a military dictatorship for a long time. There's been a Christian-Muslim civil war. There's the Niger Delta. There's the Biafra separatists, and the Soviet Union was on one side and China was on another. Horrendous history. I mean, you read more about this, you can tell what's going on. I mean, it's just, But, Goodluck Jonathan, who was a Christian, was the president for a long time. The current president now is Buhari, who's a Muslim, right? And that Christians and Muslims in that country have been played against each other. But one of the first things that Buhari did after taking office was to crush the Islamic movement of Nigeria. It's interesting, right? It's a Muslim. He's a Muslim, first Muslim president in a long time, right? Before him was Goodluck Jonathan. Big victory for the Muslims of Nigeria, who are constantly back and forth with the Christians. You have the Boko Haram terrorist stuff going on with certain local governments that support Boko Haram, which calls itself ISIS of Africa. All kinds of chaos there, different factions battling each other, and just horrendous stuff. But, Buhari takes office, and he immediately moves against Zaria, which is a stronghold of Shia Muslims, right? Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki, right, is a Shia imam, who, I mean, if you look at his program, he's a lot like Iran, right? He's not capitalism, but Islam. He's for creating kind of a socialistic society. He was having peace talks and trying to bridge the gap between Christians and Muslims. And Buhari and that military crushed him. And they crushed, and he is in military detention. I mean, it's a horrendous situation going on. But one of the first things that Buhari did when he took office was to just viciously go after the Islamic movement of Nigeria. Nigeria is, again, this is Western capitalism. Take a look at Libya. Libya prior to 2011, when it was under the leadership of Muammar Gaddafi, Islamic socialism, at that point, it was the top oil-producing country in Africa. But it was a socialist system. It was a lot like Venezuela, a lot like Russia is now, where they have, the government controls the oil. The state-controlled oil company subsidizes the rest of the economy. And under Gaddafi's leadership, Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. It had wiped out illiteracy. Universal housing was created, and they actually built the northern Africa is very dry, right? Deserts, etc. They built the world's largest irrigation system, the Great Man-Made River, this massive irrigation system, and they were taking dry desertous earth and turning it into, I kid you not, turning it into farmland. They were pumping water into the desert so that you could grow their own food. I mean, people want to say Gaddafi was brutal and stuff. I'm not here to talk about human rights. I'm just telling you in terms of economics. The economic policies of Gaddafi had tremendous results. I mean, universal college education provided to the population, wiping out illiteracy. I mean, the highest life expectancy. Gaddafi's Libya, Libyans were, with that oil money under the Islamic socialist system of Gaddafi, Libyans lived far better than anyone else on that continent. I mean, right now, people are trying to flee Libya, right? Since the war, it's gotten so bad, people drown in the Mediterranean. They have rafts, they're trying to get out. During Gaddafi's time, people were trying to get in to Libya. People were trying to get in. Gaddafi had a policy that any African, if you came to Libya, he would employ you. And there was mass migration to Libya under Gaddafi. You never hear about that. They always say, people try to flee socialist countries. All until 2011, people from all over the African continent were trying to get in to Libya. We're trying to get to Libya. People were crossing deserts to try and get to Libya, to get to the socialist prosperity that existed. The economy that Muammar Gaddafi created in Libya was very, very strong. And when those oil prices shot up, right after the U.S. invasion of Iraq and all that was going on, Libya was really growing. They were talking about creating an African currency. Libya was doing some really amazing stuff, right? Compare Gaddafi's Libya and their economy. Not the guy you heard on CNN talk about how Gaddafi killed his wife and kids. I'm talking economics here. I'm not talking about what human rights horror story you've heard. Right? There have been plenty of human rights activists and people murdered in Nigeria. Don't you think that the Nigerian military are just a bunch of peace-loving, but regardless. I'm talking economic data here. Compare Libya under Gaddafi, when it was the top oil exporting country. Compare that to Nigeria as the top oil exporting country. Nigeria is capitalism. Libya is socialism. It's like day and night. Gaddafi's Libya was massively prosperous. The living standards were rising. The educational level was rising. The life expectancy was rising. The economy was expanding. Biggest irrigation system in the world. I mean, they were doing massive things. Nigeria right now. Even when the oil prices were high. Go back to, the same time in Nigeria. Massive illiteracy, massive poverty, malnutrition, low life. I mean, come on. Compare them. Libya, Gaddafi's Libya versus ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, and Shell Oil's Nigeria. It's very, very clear that Western capitalism is not the answer. Just look at that continent, right? Just like compare Cuba to Haiti, compare Cuba to the Dominican Republic, compare Cuba to Jamaica, compare Cuba to Guatemala and Honduras. Well, compare Libya under Gaddafi to Libya today. Compare Libya under Gaddafi to Nigeria at the same time, or Nigeria today. It's pretty obvious. That socialism is better than capitalism. Okay? No question about it, right? I mean, and that's pretty blatant on the African continent. And there's another example of that needs to be stated, and I'm about to get to. Angola, right? Angola is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's an oil-rich country. It's very poor. Angola was a colony of Portugal. And then it was granted independence after the military coup and uprising and everything that happened in Portugal in the 70s. Got its independence. And so from 1975 to 2002, they had 27 years of civil war in Angola. 27 years of civil war. And why did they have 27 years of civil war? Because the party that took power in Angola was the MPLA, the People's Liberation Movement of Angola, the Communist Party. And the United States funded and armed this group called UNITA, the Union for the Total Liberation of Angola. And these terrorists in UNITA were armed and trained, and they did horrendous things. Read about UNITA, right? Jonas Savimbi was the leader of UNITA. Jonas Savimbi was a literal cannibal. Not only did he kill other people, he ate other people, right? And it's so disgusting, right? The imperialists, they would say, oh, look at these people in Africa, they're savages. And then they fund the people doing the horrendous stuff, and they declare war. MPLA is a group that was trying to modernize Angola, trying to bring Angola out of poverty. That's who we overthrow. And the U.S. government was backing a literal cannibal named Jonas Savimbi. Jonas Savimbi was a terrorist. He was a murderer. He was a monster. Read about Jonas Savimbi, whose people met with Ronald Reagan. Jonas Savimbi was a monster, murderer, terrorist, literal cannibal, disgusting person. And the USA kept Angola in a state of civil war to keep it from becoming an economically prosperous country. For 27 years, the United States was arming and funding and training UNITA. And yes, unfortunately, during the Gang of Four era in China, UNITA was calling themselves Maoists. They weren't. That was propaganda, but they were claiming to be Maoists, and they got some Chinese support. And China has officially apologized to Angola for supporting UNITA, right? Finally, in 2002, a peace treaty was signed in Angola. After how many years, right? After 27 years of civil war, a peace treaty was signed in Angola. And the MPLA, at that point, Eduardo dos Santos, right? The MPLA said, Angola starts now. And from 2002 until that oil price drop in 2014, economic miracles happened in Angola. The rate of economic growth in Angola was like 11% a year. No country in the world was experiencing so much economic growth. Angola was booming. For the first time, after 27 years of civil war, the MPLA signs a peace treaty with UNITA. UNITA controls certain territories, and they start selling oil, and Angola experienced huge rates of economic growth, unprecedented explosions of economic growth, massive, explosive economic growth, right? I mean, the capital of Angola suddenly became this fully beautiful industrial city, and China goes into Angola, and it's building railways, and it's building new highways. Parts of Angola that were never connected with major cities before suddenly have access to trade. The mining, right? Angola has oil, but suddenly they have mining in Angola. I mean, people's lives are turning around. It's like, you read about what was happening in Angola from 2002 until that oil price drop of 2014. Angola was experiencing one of the most rapid economic expansions in the African continent's history. The MPLA was teaming up with China with their Belt and Road Initiative, and real economic miracles were happening. It was unprecedented. People were rising out of poverty. Schools were being built, right? And it was a problem. The country was still littered with landmines from the war. The bridges had been destroyed. And it was like they said, Angola starts now. And the Dos Santos government, I mean, they mobilized that population, and they built Angola, and it was unprecedented what was happening in Angola, and it got no press over here. U.S. media pretended they didn't see it. It was like, oh, no, we don't see it, and it was weird. You had to read like The Economist, you had to read like economic newspapers. Nobody wanted to talk about it. We don't see Angola. We're pretending we don't see this. It was happening. Angola was exploding with socialism, with a state-controlled oil company. It was explosive amounts of economic growth. People were rising out of poverty. China was there. Russia was there. A boom was happening in Angola, and no one said anything. And who was at the center of that economic boom? Who was it? It was the daughter of the president, Isabel dos Santos, right? And this woman is an economic genius, right? She She arranged, Angola became one of the only African countries to have its own telecommunications cell phone company, Unitel. And she, she was born, in the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, and she has gone to the London School of Economics, and she was traveling around the world, and she was bringing in foreign investment. She was doing what Deng Xiaoping did in China, and she was overseeing it, right? And she created a cell phone company, and she was doing all this stuff and building. It was amazing. And yes, her father was the president, but the genius behind that economic boom in Angola, right, between 2002 and 2014, right? And Nigeria, that's an oil country too. Did they have anything near what was happening in Angola? No. Are you kidding me? No, they didn't have, but Angola is booming. And the genius who's making it happen, the genius woman, is Isabel dos Santos. She is making it happen. She was the one who did it. And then, of course, we know the oil prices dropped in 2014. Isabel dos Santos becomes head of the state-run oil company. Right? The elections happen, and for the first time, her father is no longer the president. Another wing of the MPLA comes into power. A more pro-Western, a less pro-Chinese wing of the MPLA comes into power. A more free market neoliberal wing of the MPLA party comes into power. And when that happens, immediately, you read about it in the Wall Street Journal. They spell it out for you. They spell it out in plain English. The big oil companies from France, Total, BP, Chevron, Shell, they decide Isabel's got to go. And they pulled out of Angola, demanding that Isabel dos Santos be fired. And they ousted her. And they ran her name through the mud. And, she's out of leadership. And the current government of Angola, is basically dealing with an economic crisis. Because all of a sudden, right, at this point, the oil prices aren't booming. They're privatizing things. She refused. The Wall Street Journal calls out Isabel dos Santos because she refused to privatize the natural gas. Right? Angola's got a huge amount of natural gas. American gas companies are saying, hey, you got some natural gas here. Do you mind if we? And she was saying, that belongs to the people. And she holds up the Constitution of Angola, and she says, natural resources belong to the people. You can't have our natural gas. They can't handle that. American oil companies say, we want to bring in our own parts. And she says, you're going to buy from Angolan companies. She stands up for her people. She enforces the environmental laws. Right? You read about this. They're calling her out. She is an economic genius. She knows what she's doing. Right? And she's not going to let big oil companies walk all over her. So the new president comes in, ousts her. And the economy in Angola, since 2014, since that price drop, since the new president has been in there, has been shit. I'm sorry. Look at what's happening in Angola. Poverty is expanding all of a sudden. Everything that was built up, after the Civil War is over, is crumbling. There's strikes going on. There's hunger. There's unrest going on. And so the new government of Angola decides, well, we're going to blame Isabel dos Santos for it. It's beyond me. It is beyond me. How in the world can you blame? This is the woman who oversaw the economic explosion. But in order to protect themselves, the neoliberal wing, the pro-Western free market neoliberal wing of the MPLA is at this point trying to blame all the problems that they themselves created on the woman who oversaw the economic explosion. I kid you not. And now this entity called the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, the people who brought you the Panama Papers, have, dumped all of this information on her. And we know, first of all, ICIJ, it's now a matter of public record that they're funded by Soros, number one, and they're funded by the USAID. So they're basically a wing of American intelligence, right? Soros has been doing the CIA color revolution thing for years. USAID, it's really obvious what it is. American intelligence dumped a whole bunch of info on her, and they've frozen her bank accounts, and they are trying to destroy Isabel dos Santos. The socialist, the heroic, strong African woman who fought for her people, the economic genius who utilized state central planning to build up, like a telecom. And I mean, this is a woman who studied economics, studied Deng Xiaoping theory. I mean, genius woman, right? And they are trying to destroy her, right? And then after, now she's, her bank accounts are frozen, they're charging her with corruption. Now they have said, BBC has revealed why they want to destroy her. Get ready for this. Because she's going to run for president. BBC sounded the alarm. She's going to run for president. I mean, her father led Angola through the Civil War. Her father worked closely with Fidel Castro and spent 27 years fighting the UNITA terrorists. And BBC basically confirms that she has political aspirations. Isabel dos Santos, the economic genius, could very well be the next president of Angola. And she could win, because people remember when she was running the Angolan economy, how well things did. She gave people their first job. She brought the country out of poverty. She brought in foreign investment. She created Unitel. People know that with Isabel in power, with somebody whose parents were guerrilla fighters. Her parents were Che Guevara's, right? I mean, she wasn't born in Angola. She was born in the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan. Her parents went into exile because they were freedom fighters against the Portuguese colonialists, right? They know that with a fighter like Isabel dos Santos, they're going to get a better deal. They're going to get a better deal, and they know it. And so they are waging at this point, trying to utilize this corruption stuff to get rid of Isabel dos Santos. It's the same thing that they did in Brazil to Lula da Silva, the same thing they did to Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, the same thing they've done to Cristina Kirchner. Corruption. Corruption's a very hard thing to define, folks. It's an extremely, extremely hard thing to define. What is corruption? What is it? I don't know. I mean, here's the thing, right? In the United States, if a labor union shows up at a politician's office with a suitcase, that's corruption. And they go to jail. They're bribing a government official. But if a big corporation sets up a super PAC, and that super PAC starts running advertisements on television, and no one really knows who funds this super PAC, that's not corruption. That's obeying U.S. election law. Sounds like corruption to me, but corruption is legally defined. That's the thing. Corruption is according to the law. It's not according to someone's ethical code, right? And that what we refer to as corruption is a big problem. You go anywhere in the third world, you're going to have a huge problem with corruption, and there's huge problems with corruption in Angola. I'm not pretending that corruption doesn't exist, right? There's huge problems with corruption. Example, right? Any third world country I have ever been to, right? If you leave Western Europe and the United States, Australia, you leave Western countries, right? People say don't ever call the police. And why? Why do you never call the police? Well, you never call the police because the police, when they show up, will want to bribe. And if you don't bribe them, you're going to jail. And it doesn't matter, right? You go to Mexico, don't call the police. You go to South America, don't call the police. You go to any country in Africa, you don't call the police, because the police show up and they point a gun in your face and they want to bribe. And if they don't get a bribe, you're going to jail, right? I mean, the corruption is very, very extreme, right? And that this is what happens when people are dirt poor. When people are in extreme levels of poverty, in countries where you have mass malnutrition and these kind of problems, people take care of each other. When people are desperate, they depend on each other more, right? They depend on each other. That's why talk about individual liberty and the rights of man didn't even arise until Europe in the 1700s, because until then, people were the level of scarcity and the lack of material abundance was so extreme that individualism wasn't even a thing. Right? That when people are desperate, they depend on each other, right? And if you're in a country, like a developing country, and you work in the government, everyone who knows you, every relative is going to say, hey, what can you do for me? Right? Nepotism, corruption, these kind of things are a big problem in developing countries. They're a huge problem, I don't care which developing country it is. And we have it in the Western world too. And don't pretend that we don't have it. Like I just said, super PACs. Great example of corruption in the United States is what they call civil asset forfeiture. I don't know if people have read about civil asset forfeiture. In the United States, there's been this trend in the United States of the police, they stop somebody and they've got a huge amount of cash. And the police say to the person, you got a huge amount of cash. There's a story like a couple that was driving from one end of the USA to another, right? And they had a bunch of cash. They were going to buy a house or something. And the police pull over and they see that you got some cash. And they're like, ooh, that's a lot of money you got there. I think that's evidence. Yeah, we think you're suspected of being a drug dealer and we'll be taking that. And they seize it under civil asset forfeiture. And then all the charges are dropped. You weren't dealing drugs. That's not evidence. But you never get that money back, do you? Oh, God, right? Read about civil asset forfeiture. Read about it. It's going on all across the United States. Police show up and take people's money and take people's stuff. And the people are never convicted of a crime. All the charges against them are thrown out. But, hey, we keep it anyway because that's the way civil asset forfeiture's laws work, right? That's called theft, folks, and it happens all across the United States. That's corruption, right? When the police show up and seize your property as evidence, and you're acquitted of all the charges, and you never get your property back, that's called theft, right? Corruption is a problem, and it's weird to define. The definition of the word corrupt is when something is functioning other than intended. If you have a corrupt file on your computer, it is a file that doesn't function as it's intended to function. That's all the word corrupt means. And it's a really weird word because, we say it's corruption, but the U.S. political system, just like the political system of all the capitalist countries, is designed to function in a way that billionaires and bankers get rich. So is it corrupt if that's what's happening? I don't know. I mean, it's a very, very weird, hard word to define. They are going after Isabel dos Santos right now, the same way they went after Dilma, the same way they went after Lula da Silva, the same way they went after Christina Kirchner. They've done stuff even after he hasn't been president against Ahmadinejad in Iran. It's the same thing, and it comes from the same entity, the people who brought you the Panama Papers, the ICIJ, the CIA, the CIA response to WikiLeaks, basically, the ICIJ, right? That's what's going on here, right? And they are afraid of what Isabel dos Santos could create in Libya. They're afraid of what Isabel dos Santos could create in Angola. Isabel dos Santos could be the best thing that Angola ever has. What she achieved from 2002 to 2014 under her father's administration when she was doing miracles in the private sector, they are afraid that Isabel dos Santos could be the Hugo Chavez of Southern Africa, right? I mean, she could be the Hugo Chavez of Southern Africa. She could be the Deng Xiaoping of Angola, right? She could create a socialist economic boom, an economic boom of people opening their own businesses, micro-entrepreneurs centered around a state-controlled oil company. She could do something really, really powerful, right? She could do it, and they don't want her to do it. That's what the attack on her is about. That's what it's about. That is what it's about, right? Isabel dos Santos, the richest woman in Africa, right? They are trying to prevent her from taking power, from pushing the free market wing of the MPLA out of power, and they are trying to basically, at this point, keep her out of the presidency, because she would win. There's no question she would win. If she ran, she would win. People remember, so many people owe their lives to her. She said herself, I gave many people their first job, and that's true, right? I mean, what she achieved economically is unprecedented. She is a genius. Listen to some speeches by her. A brilliant woman. She is a genius. She understands economics. Her parents were heroes fighting against colonialism, right? I mean, she is all about economic development, about the Belt and Road, about the Eurasian Economic Union. That's why they're going after her. They don't like Isabel dos Santos. That's what's going on. If you want to understand the crisis in Angolan politics, that's what's going on. They don't want Angola to prosper the way Libya prospered under Gaddafi's leadership. They don't want that. They don't want the oil resources to be utilized to stabilize and build up a strong economy in Angola. They want African countries to stay poor. That's what they want. They want African countries to stay poor. That's what's going on. And I needed to say that. It's been bugging me. I wrote an article. It should be published pretty soon about it. Hope you check that out. But, Isabel dos Santos, the way they're going after her, it's not about corruption. It's not about corruption. It's not about, I don't know. It's not about human rights or, it's about the fact that she could raise Angola out of poverty. That's what it's about. It's that simple. They don't want her to be utilizing, to do what she did when she was the leader of the state-run oil company, Sonangol. That's all there is to it. It is that simple. So, folks, what else do you want me to talk about, right? Super chats are welcome. Send me a super chat. Ask me your question. I think I have a super chat to answer about intersectionality. So I'm being asked about intersectionality. As a concept, intersectionality is not problematic. It's not, right? That, wanting women to be safe from sexual assault and rape and discrimination, and that's certainly tied in with the struggle of working class people. Wanting to abolish racism and discrimination in terms of race is certainly tied in with the workers' struggle and the right of workers on the job. The right of people to not be discriminated against, the right of people to not face harassment, the empowerment of groups that have been marginalized. The concept of intersectionality, I have no problem with, and I agree with, right? That these, the struggle for disempowered people to gain empowerment, and the class struggle, the economic struggle of the workers, against the bosses, the billionaires and bankers against the masses of the population, are tied in with each other. No question about it. However, I think the concept of intersectionality is that's basic Marxism. It's what Marxists have been saying since the beginning of time, right? But here's the thing. And this is where it gets complicated. There's something called intersectionality theory that is explicitly anti-Marxist. On the campuses now, there's what you call oppression theory. It started with the Frankfurt School, right? Frankfurt School was a long-standing Marxist tradition in Germany. In the post-war period, in the 50s, it started getting CIA funding. You had the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and there was an effort to try and push this alternative to Marxism. This alternative to Marxism that was about oppression theory. And that's big on the campuses now. It's very big on the campuses now. And it's this idea, well, Marxism reduces everything to class. It's class reductionist. So don't be a Marxist, because that's not good. Intersectionality, and we just study movies. We watch movies, and we learn how movies are racist and sexist. And don't be a Marxist. Marxists are bad. I don't want to say too much about it. But the concept of intersectionality, I agree with. It's pretty basic. Intersectionality theory, oppression theory, I don't know what you want to call it, postmodernism, all that stuff, that's not me. And that stuff is a kind of an anti-Marxist current, right? It's a bat they use to beat Marxists over the head with. Right? If you believe in Marx, if you believe in economics, if you believe in class struggle, well, that makes you racist, sexist, and homophobic. Great example, folks. Great example. I've used this example before. And this is a great example of what's wrong with the leftism on the campuses these days. Right? In the 1960s, there was an organization called Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. Right? SDS was probably the most important radical group of the 60s. Maybe the Black Panthers were more important, but it's like the second most important radical group of the 60s, right? SDS, they led huge anti-war rallies. They organized, they shut down campuses, they did all kinds of protests. They broke apart in 1969. A wing of them became ultra-left adventurers, and some of them became the new communist movement, and it's a whole complicated story. But from like the early 60s to like 1969, anybody who was anything in the United States, who was a socialist or a communist or an activist, was somehow connected to SDS. And that SDS was set up by the United Auto Workers, and it was originally, it banned any communists from joining, and it's a whole complicated story. There's like, actually, I think somewhere I have like a comic book history of SDS. But anyway, SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, was an important group. If you were a radical or a leftist, if you were opposed to the Vietnam War, if you were opposed to racism and Jim Crow segregation in the USA, Students for a Democratic Society is a group that you knew about, right? And you were involved with. And eventually it went, it fell apart, and a lot of factionalism and some terrorist, ultra-left adventurous stuff. But, in its incarnation, when it existed as a group with like 1 or 2 million members, huge organization. It's actually a lot like DSA is now, right? Big tent, anyone could join. And it was like the same people, like Michael Harrington and Tom Hayden, and, okay, so SDS was this really important radical group in the 60s, right? SDS had big problems in terms of women, right? It was sexist, right? The people talk about in SDS, the women just made the coffee, the men gave all the speeches, sexual harassment. it had big problems with the way women were treated. That's not acceptable at all, right? Big problem, right? Big problem, right? And a lot's been written about it. You know, feminists and women's theorists have written stacks and stacks of books critiquing SDS for the way women were treated in the group, because the way women were treated was not right, and they had very big grievances. Here's the thing. I now meet many young people who are studying and getting their degree and learning all about leftism and taking gender studies or queer studies or black studies. And I'll mention SDS, and we'll be talking about the 1960s, and I'll say, well, there's this group called SDS. And they'll say, you mean that sexist group? They're not wrong. SDS had huge problems on the gender question. But that's not why SDS was important. And that's the thing. These people are revisionists without knowing what they're revising. It's important to talk about all the problems that SDS had, but SDS was the cutting edge of 1960s radicalism. That's why it was such a big problem that they had issues on the gender question, right? I mean, that they were, you know, so huge, right? They were a mass organization. They led huge efforts against the Vietnam War, huge efforts for civil rights. I mean, you know, you talk about what was going on at Columbia University, that was SDS. You talk about the Democratic National Convention, the protests. SDS was massive. It was pushing people into motion. And so, yes, but these people don't know about any of that. They don't know about Columbia University. They don't know about the protests at the 1968 Democratic Convention. They don't know anything about it. But in their gender theory class, they read an essay by somebody talking about SDS as sexist, and they talk about the sexist group SDS. That's what gender theory is. That's what intersectionality is, right? It's this kind of like rewriting. So if you were to, and then the idea is, if you get up and say, hey, SDS did great things in the 60s, sexist! It reduces, it's about deconstruction, essentially. That's, postmodernism is the idea that there is no grand narrative about the history of humanity, right? You know, that obviously the Western narrative is wrong, capitalism is wrong, but socialism is also wrong. There is no grand narrative. Deconstruction. The ideal state of being is deconstruction. This is Frankfurt School. This is, you know, Adorno. Deconstruction. You know, that Marxism is good when you use it as a vehicle for deconstruction. But when you try to build a socialist society, no, that's authoritarian. Marxism is a vehicle for creating chaos and deconstruction. And so SDS, it was this massive group that did a lot. No, deconstruct it. It's all about deconstruction. That is my critique of postmodernism. That is my critique of intersectionality theory. I agree with a lot of what they say, but they see deconstruction as the only value. That's what they think. They think deconstruction, taking things apart, is the ideal thing. And if Marxism is anything but a vehicle for taking things apart, it's unacceptable. That's the synthetic left. That's Rockefeller leftism, right? That's postmodernism. And the entire thesis of my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, is understanding that the essence of Marxism is not deconstruction. Marxism is not about destruction and chaos. Marxism is about building. Marxism is the modern-day inheritor of Socrates and the Academy of Athens. Marxism is the inheritor of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Marxism is the city-building tendency in human history. Marxism is an effort to say that profits and the anarchy of production should not be in command. Marxism is an effort to say that we can do better than this, that we can build a society where people are cared for, we can organize society more rationally and more effectively. We can build a better and more healthy alternative to capitalism. That's what Marxism is. Marxism is not simply a vehicle for deconstruction, and that's what the postmodern synthetic left thinks it is. They think Marxism is good because it disproves some of the myths that hold American society together. Well, it does, right? I mean, the myth that American capitalism is the best system, that people just work hard, get ahead, well, Marxism does a very good job of deconstructing those myths. It deconstructs for the purpose of building something better, not because deconstruction is the ideal. And Susan Sontag, that individual, right? If you read her essays, she basically declares all constructivism, all collectivism, all joint effort, all efforts to build strong group identity to be fascism. And that's what this whole stupid red-brown thing is about, right? If you try to build anything, you're a fascist. That's basically what the synthetic left believes. Mao, the fact that he mobilized millions of people to try and build a new China, that's fascist, right? You know, Fidel Castro, because he tried to mobilize people in Cuba to build a new society, that's fascist, right? Bernie Sanders, he's mobilizing young people to want to, oh, fascist, right? That all that being a leftist is about creating space for individuality and alternative narratives and deconstruction. We're just going to take everything apart. We're going to rip everything apart. There is no truth, and if you believe in truth, you're a fascist. That's what postmodernism is, and it's a cancer. It's a cancer. I'm sorry. It is the reason that leftists are hated so much, right? It is the reason that people don't feel, working class people whose lives are being made chaotic and unpredictable and scary and miserable by capitalism have no interest in joining socialist and communist groups. Because communist groups are all about making things more chaotic and more unstable and more afraid, that the desire for order, right? That capitalism creates massive disorder and that socialism brings order. But the 1960s left, postmodernism, Susan Sontag, they don't believe that. They believe that socialists are people that want even more disorder. Right now, people are scared. There are millions of Americans right now who are scared. I want to talk, this is who the left needs to talk to, right? It's one thing to talk to people on the campuses. It's one thing to talk to people that are Bernie Sanders supporters. There are millions of Americans who voted for Barack Obama. And they're not deeply ideological. Not deeply ideological. They voted for Barack Obama because they were suffering. The financial crisis was there. The Bush economic downturn was there. They lost their homes. They lost their jobs. They were running up debt. They were afraid. And they saw on TV Barack Obama. And he said, yes, we can. And he tried to make change. They voted for Obama. And there are millions of Americans who voted for Barack Obama in the hope that he would make their lives better. And he didn't. And then they voted for Trump. Millions of Americans. They saw Trump on TV, and he said he would make their lives better. He spoke to the things that were upsetting them, and they voted for him. They're not deeply political. They're not ideological. They're not far left. They're not far right. They're not reading. They don't have a bookshelf like this. They're not thinking about things deeply the way you and I are. They're suffering. They are worried about paying their bills. They're worried about losing their jobs. They're worried about the debt that they've run up. They're scared. And they gave Obama a chance, and he didn't fix it. And they gave Trump a chance, and he didn't fix it. They might give Bernie a chance this time around, and he better fix it. Or else they're going to... There are millions of people who aren't deeply impacted by politics. They aren't. I mean, they just... I'm sitting here, and I'm going on about the Russian Revolution, and I wrote a whole big book and all of that. That's a whole big thing. There are millions of people who just don't want to suffer anymore. They want the chaos to end. They want to be taken care of. And furthermore, they want something to believe in. They want something to believe in. They don't want to be in this weird state of mind where everything's a matter of opinion, there is no truth. They want something to believe in. They want a leader who will help them. They thought Obama was that leader. He wasn't. They thought Trump was that leader. He wasn't. They want there to be a face on TV that they can trust, who will take care of them and make their lives better. That's what millions of Americans want. Susan Sontag, Judith Butler, they ain't going to give that to them. They don't want that. They think that's fascist. There are millions of Americans who want an American Hugo Chavez. There are millions of Americans who want an American Evo Morales. There are millions of Americans who want, an American Daniel Ortega. There are millions of Americans who want a leader who will run the government in a way that makes their life better and will take care of them, and they can turn on the TV and trust them. Millions of Americans want a government of action that will fight for working families. That's what they want. Deep down, millions of Americans want a government of action that will fight for working families. And they don't care. They don't care. They are not in that state of mind where it's like, oh, I better vote for, far left, far right. Oh my God, look what this guy said 50 years ago, or what this thing he said. They're not there. They just want their life to get better. They want a government of action that will fight for working families. They want a government that will hear their cry, that will hear that they are suffering, and won't sit back and do nothing about it. They want a government of action that will fight for working families like them. That's what they want. They want there to be a face on TV they can trust. They want someone they can believe in. And they're trying. Some of these same people that went to Obama's rallies and cried and sobbed, and yes, he can, yes, he can. They go to Trump rallies. The exact same people. I know them. I know them. I actually know some of these people, right? Not through my political work, but through, my hometown. And I know people that cried and loved Obama and now cry and love Trump and just get frustrated because it doesn't happen. They're frustrated because it hasn't happened. They're suffering. They have been suffering, especially since 2008, 2009. They've been suffering before that, right? They're seeing their communities destroyed. The water is not purified. The roads outside their homes are crumbling. The schools their kids are going to are falling apart, and they are suffering. The reality is the leaders of the United States, and this is very important. This is a little bit different than the classical Marxist understanding. This is a geopolitical understanding. The leaders of the United States view the United States as the center of a global trade network. And that's why we have this coastal situation where the USA is crumbling, Midwest is crumbling, South is crumbling, it's all crumbling except for Southern California and New England, right? New York City's economy is doing great, Southern California is doing great, but there's this whole vast country, states like Oklahoma and Minnesota and Ohio and Oregon, not part of it. They're falling apart. They're not getting what they need. Their living standard is going down. People are dying from opioids. Right? The U.S. economy, the leaders of our economy, I'm sorry to use a Trump word, they're globalists. They are believers in imperialism. They believe in monopoly capitalism. They believe in reaping super profits from the entire planet. They believe in controlling the international financial system. And the international financial system says New York City and Southern California can be the center of a global network of trade, and that's how we make a lot of money. They view the United States as the center of Atlanticism. This is London economics. This is London economics, right? This is how the British Empire, you read about the British Empire, they didn't give a flying hoot about the people in Scotland. They didn't give a flying hoot about the people in the country. They were all about London and maybe a little bit about Glasgow, right? Because there was some, trade there and all of that. So, this is Atlanticist economics. The United States economy should be centered around New York City and Southern California because they're trade hubs, right? There's big monopoly corporations that can make money off the whole world, and, all roads lead to Rome, all roads lead to New York and the stock exchange, all roads lead to, Silicon Valley and Hollywood, and that's the U.S. economy. They don't view the United States itself as an economic entity. They see the United States as two regions, right? The northeastern corridor and the Southern California, Silicon Valley. They see the United States as home to two centers in a global apparatus of trade. That's how they see the United States. That's what the USA is as far as they are. The USA is great, America is great, because it's the home to Southern California and New York City. They see the United States as the central part, just like London, of the Atlanticist, global imperialist financial trade apparatus. That's how they see the United States. That's what they see the USA as. They don't see the United States as a prosperous economic entity. The rest of the United States does not matter as far as they are concerned. And that is what needs to change. The government has no desire. It sees the population of the United States. This is very important. The population of the United States at this point is viewed as a burden. Let me repeat that. The population of the United States is a burden. It's a big problem. You know, New York City is fine, Southern California is fine, but the rest of this country, we have all these people there, and they all need jobs, and it's a problem. Can they just, you know, maybe stop procreating? Can we lock them in jail? Can we, I mean, I kid you not. They see the fact that there are people throughout the United States as an annoying problem. Malthusianism, overpopulation. I kid you not. Instead of seeing the population as an asset, they see the population as a problem. They don't want to invest in the population. They don't want to give them good schools to go to. They don't want to give them the, new roads to drive on. They don't even want, look at the malls are crumbling. They don't need them. They got robots. They got Amazon. They don't need small stores. They don't need retail. This is the reality, right? That as the global capitalist system moves toward total robot automation and all of that, they basically don't see the population as an asset. Right? And they see the United States as just the center of a global apparatus of capitalism, right? They have an Atlanticist worldview. And this is what has to change. These people are desperate. They are suffering. They voted for Obama. They voted for Trump. And these are the people that if a real socialist movement came into existence, what Bernie Sanders is doing, hey, it's great in a lot of ways, but it's not real socialism, right? If a real socialist movement came along, it would say, no. We are going to fight for you. We are going to have a government of action that will fight for working families. We are going to have a government of action that will fight for working families. That's what a real mass socialist movement would be. It would be a mobilization of all these people that have been locked out, all these people that are being left behind, all these people that they're strategically getting rid of, the people that they have a plan for just kind of getting rid of them, right? And that's the reality. We know the prison industrial complex exploded when the factories left the urban areas. They left the urban areas first, they left the rural areas second. But, after it was clear that there were not factory jobs in the 70s and 80s, as they were closing the factory jobs in the urban areas, the prison industrial complex sprung up, locking people in prison for profits, right? What they did to the African American community, what they did to Detroit is now expanding. They're doing to the entire country, right? It used to be, that it was only the black working class who was singled out. Now they are doing it to the entire country. They are figuring out how to gradually make money off of gradually getting us to go away because they don't have a place for us in their global economy. This is very scary, folks. What's happening now is very, very scary. And we need a government of action that will fight for working families. And Trump, folks, I've never really liked Trump, but this last State of the Union, Jesus, made me sick. Really made me sick. The economic statistics. He said this is the greatest economy that the USA has ever had. Really? 1950s? Oh, no. This is the greatest. The greatest. The U.S. economy has never been better than it is now, right? All these young people stuck in low-wage jobs. No. And what proof do you need of that? Oh, the unemployment rate. Right? Now look at the rate of workforce participation rate. Look at it, right? I mean, Americans, the official unemployment rate is pretty low, but the workforce participation rate is also pretty low, right? He says wages. Well, wages have slightly gone up. Well, compared to what they were a generation ago, no, they haven't. Right? I mean, the economy of the United States, look at retail stores. Look at how many retail layoffs. Macy's is closing stores all over the country. All those people are losing their jobs. I mean, capitalism is facing a crisis. And for Trump to say this is the greatest economy that has ever been, he's a cynical liar. I mean, it's one thing to make yourself look good, but I'm sorry. And then he gives a medal to Rush Limbaugh, a guy who, makes fart jokes and insults people on the radio. The best moment, I thought, of Trump's 2016 campaign was the Republican primary. Where he said to Jeb Bush, you lied, there were no weapons of mass destruction and all of that. It was great. It's tremendous, right? Because that's true. Everyone knows that, right? There were no weapons of mass destruction. Invading Iraq was a disaster. He said exactly the same kind of things that like Michael Moore was saying in 2003 and 2004. You know, good for Trump for saying that, right? What I think is weird is that Trump just gave the Presidential Medal of Freedom to somebody who advocated executing people who said that. I'm sorry, I was politically talking about politics a lot in Ohio. And I was in a town full of people who listened to Rush Limbaugh, and they all, you know, if you didn't agree with the war, you were a terrorist, you needed to move to another country. Rush Limbaugh was on there. Ann Coulter, who another big Trump fan, you know, she said that they should have the death penalty so liberals know they can get the death penalty. I mean, it was like, if you didn't agree with invading Iraq, you deserved to die and be tortured in Guantanamo. That was Rush Limbaugh. That was Rush Limbaugh. That was his message. If you don't agree with this war, you need to be tortured. Yes, I'm Rush Limbaugh. Right? That was the message. And now Donald Trump said exactly what Michael Moore said, exactly what I said in my little town in high school and got an endless amount of shit for saying. You know, I mean, Trump took the White House as the Republican nominee, saying that the Iraq War was based on a lie, and that Jeb Bush and his brother, they lied, there were no weapons of mass destruction, that it's been a disaster invading Iraq. And he just gave the Medal of Freedom to someone who basically advocated executing people for saying that. That basically said you were a member of Al-Qaeda if you said that. I mean, it's disgusting. The Trump speech, you know, it's weird. In Trump's first speech, there was a bunch of populism, like Steve Bannon stuff, right? And then Trump's other speeches, that last State of the Union was the worst State of the Union I have heard in a long, long time. I mean, it was first of all, he's making it reality TV, reuniting the family, exploiting grieving people who just had a relative die and they're crying, and he's using their grief and their pain, having lost a relative. You know, there's got this crying couple on there talking about their relative who died, and then he blames the death of their relative on Qasem Soleimani. Well, without even it's disgusting. It was reality TV. It was emotions cranked up, crank up the volume on the emotions, reuniting the family, a guy whose relative was killed and he's crying. It was disgusting. It was a disgusting State of the Union. Lying and trying to pretend that all the economic problems we're having don't exist, exploiting grieving relatives, giving a reward to one of the, I'm not a fan of Rush Limbaugh, okay? Okay, he's having some health problems. He may not be with us much longer, but, I don't want anyone, you never celebrate someone else's death, okay? I hope his family, is not in too much pain or whatever, whatever. But I don't think Rush Limbaugh is worthy of any kind of medal. I'm sorry, folks. And he basically advocated executing and torturing anyone who said the kind of things that Trump said when he took office. So the whole thing was disgusting from beginning to end. I watched the speech. Go look at my tweets. I tweeted all through it. I tweeted all through the speech. I gave my opinion. That was a disgusting speech. It was disgusting. Disgusting. I was disgusted by that State of the Union. All the stuff that the establishment was afraid of Donald Trump about. The anti-war stuff, right? All that anti-war stuff, right? That he was going to stop meddling around the world. Great nations don't grade wars. None of that. America's strong and powerful and wages big wars, and he's going to reunite families and be afraid of immigrants. It was disgusting. It was a disgusting speech from beginning to end. And that's why I predict that Trump will be reelected. 80% chance. Whatever they were afraid of before, they ain't scared of it anymore. He killed Qasem Soleimani, escalated everything. He's doubled down. He is everything that they were worried about with Trump, gone. You know what I mean? Trump is this is George W. Bush with a better reality TV script, right? He puts on a good show, right? He put on a good show. We've got the policies of George W. Bush, escalating tensions around the world, privatizing things, school choice. It's Bush. This is George W. Bush as president with more reality TV and a constant soap opera and an active Twitter page full of typos. That's what we've got here. The Trump presidency, it's George W. Bush with a much more charismatic actor. Trump is very charismatic. He's a good actor, good speaker, good performer. He knows how to work the media. This is the Bush administration. This is neoconservatism with better optics, with better slick marketing. That's what the Trump presidency has become. And, you know, that's all there is to it. You know, I mean, there were things about Trump that disgusted me from day one, but there were things about Trump I kind of liked too. It was complicated. I didn't vote for Trump, but I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton either, and, you know, whatever. But this is disgusting. And he'll win the next election, no question. Well, who knows what could happen. If the economy crashes, right? Now, if the economy crashes, I could very easily see him losing, right? If something were to happen right before the November vote and the economy tanked, he's been doubling down really hard, right? And that's the thing. I mean, you know, Hillary Clinton, that basket of deplorables moment was what sunk her, right? The fact that she didn't visit Wisconsin and all of that, but the fact that she called Trump's supporters deplorables, right? She basically said to anyone who's got a Trump supporter in your family, I think you're shit. That's what did Hillary Clinton in. She couldn't recover from that. Trump, he has doubled way too hard down. He has doubled down. He has put all his chips on the economy. It's the best economy that's ever been. If the economy goes down, if any kind of dramatic downturn happens between now and November, he's out of there, in my opinion. All right? He has put all his chips on the economy. I suspect, however, that he wouldn't have done that if he didn't have a pretty clear understanding of what, that he's going to come out of this victorious, right? It may be, well, never mind. I don't want to speculate too much. But yes, if there's a big economic downturn, all this economic boasting will be Trump's undoing. But barring an economic crisis, Trump has got this in the bag. I'm saying 80% chance of Trump being elected. 80% chance I'd give it, right? I don't think he'll debate Bernie Sanders, as I said at the beginning of the debate. I think that, or the live here, I think that if Sanders is the nominee, Trump will not debate Sanders. And if the Democrats, rig it against Bernie Sanders, that will once again embarrass the Democratic Party, and we'll get a nominee who won't have the charisma. I think that Trump has pretty much got this in the bag. Barring an economic collapse, I think Trump has got this in the bag. But, who knows? Now, is it possible the Democrats nominate Bernie Sanders? Very possible at this point. I wouldn't rule it out, right? I mean, Iowa, New Hampshire, it's looking good for Bernie. If Bernie ends up becoming the nominee, right? The only circumstances where I think Trump could lose this election is if Bernie were the nominee, number one, and the economy took a serious downturn. Under those circumstances, I could see it happening. But, a lot's going to happen between now and November, folks. A lot is going to happen. And I'm going to be all over it. I'm going to be at the conventions. I'm going to be all over it. So stay tuned. We're going to keep doing our thing here. The show will continue. I'll continue to give you all kinds of predictions. The show must go on, as they say, and I'm always on top of it. And we're a community here. You watch these lives with me. I'm responding to your comments and questions. And we're just going to keep doing this, right? So much to say, so much to do. Yeah, there you go. So, folks, we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat this aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Best wishes, folks. I'm out.